Real quick, so a while back I made several videos where I went era by era covering the entire history of the Forgotten Realms. The series was a huge success and seemingly everyone loved it. However, it did bother me that looking back at the videos, it would be hard to tell which videos were part of the series, as I had made other content in between those releases. So I figured that I would just edit all of them together into one single cohesive video so that I could just have the entire history of the realms in one glorious location. And, well, this is that video. You're about to embark on a journey, my friend, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. Now, this here is the planet that we are going to be talking about. Its name is Aber Toril. Now, the reason why the planet has two names will become apparent later, but for now, know that the planet is under an ice age as of the beginning of this story. Whatever happened before the ice age is mythical history, and it's completely up to the interpretation of gods as to what exactly transpired. Many races have, of course, their own mythological origin story for the planet, and of course, they all differ in many ways, but they all agree on one thing. There was a massive war between two different groups, the gods and the primordials. Now, what exactly are gods and what are the primordials falls outside of the scope of this video, but you can consider gods to be entities manifested by the hopes, dreams, angers, fears, and all kinds of emotions and wishes of living entities, made manifest by the same energies that created the multiverse. And then you can consider the primordials to be the raw amalgamation of the elements, creatures that have existed beyond time. What happens when you put raw elements or power together and then it grows a sentient? But regardless of whatever transpired during this ancient mythological conflict, the world was now encased in ice, and whatever existed on this planet before this ice was now dead and long forgotten. When the ice eventually receded, it revealed a single big megacontinent called Meuroboros. Over time, the first sentient species started to develop in this new continent, and those first species we call the creator races. Of these races, we have the Sorok, which are reptilian and snake-like, the Petrai, which were amphibian, the Eri, which were avian, the Fae, which we actually don't know much about how they used to be back then, and then the humans, which were primitive ape-like creatures. The first species to dominate were the Soroks, which were granted tremendous knowledge and power by a mysterious deity called the World Serpent. It is said that by the time this god approached them, the Soroks were nothing more than savages in these wild, untamed lands. However, this god offered them the knowledge of magic and how to smith tools and weapons, and all it asked in return was obedience and many blood sacrifices, which the Soroks happily obliged. Using the knowledge granted by the World Serpent, the Soroks conquered the world and ushered the greatest kingdom that this planet will ever see, even to this day. It is believed that their kingdom literally spanned the entire planet. Now, during the climax of their rise to power, they came up with the idea to consolidate every single bit of learned magical knowledge into one single magical item. They effectively traveled throughout the entire kingdom, which at the time was the whole planet, and grabbed every single bit of magical knowledge, every spell created, every technique for how to craft items, everything that related to magic, and recorded it into a series of magical scrolls. These scrolls would end up becoming the most powerful magical item in the history of the Forgotten Realms, and of course, not as strong as some of the artifacts that may have been created by gods and span the multiverse, but in terms of magical items like created by mortals here on this planet, these are the most powerful. We call these the Nether Scrolls. Now, what makes these scrolls so particularly powerful and effective at teaching magic is that the content of the scrolls appears before you as you attempt to read it, and the content tailors itself to you so that every time you read an individual scroll, you will always learn something new with seemingly no limit to how
how much information a single scroll may contain. But then through war, civil strife, and perhaps maybe even fate, the scrolls would inevitably be lost as the Empire of the Seroks would eventually fail and its pages would find themselves scattered all across the planet, found by different societies and peoples throughout history. It is believed that the vast majority of all magic cast today in the world of the Forgotten Realms can be somehow traced back to the Nether Scrolls in one way or another. In any case, the Empire of the Seroks collapsed in what you may call something of a crisis of faith. See, gods are made powerful by the veneration of mortals, and gods can be created and destroyed with enough faith or lack thereof. Because the Empire of the Seroks was all-encompassing, the veneration of the World Serpent was mandatory within the Empire. Every single species that existed at the time had to pray to this god. However, each different species had its own wants and desires, wishes, dreams, and fears. The World Serpent was forced to become this entity that was oftentimes contradictory, being a god of tyranny and enslavement for the Seroks, but then a god of freedom and choice for some of the disenfranchised, enslaved races. The World Serpent was then forced to sort of split into multiple personalities, multiple deities within one. Some fragments which ended up fighting against each other, which of course furthered that civil strife within the Empire. This was compounded by the increasing reliance on slaves by the Empire to the point where the Yuan-Ti, which were a snake-like creation of the Seroks, basically manned the entire Empire. They were the war masters, the diplomats, the shopkeepers, the construction workers, the servants, and the guards. Anything and everything that could be delegated to the Yuan-Ti was delegated to the Yuan-Ti, while the Seroks simply lived a life of hedonism until eventually the Empire sort of slowly weakened and collapsed into pieces throughout the next set of 1,000 years. And as the Yuan-Ti slowly started taking over these cities as the new masters, the Petrai started gaining more and more power and slowly became the new overlords of the world. But the power vacuum that the Seroks had left began emboldening many different species within the world, including the giants and the titans that existed in the north, which started a massive war against the Petrai. Now, this war between the Petrai and the titans was being won by the titans, and so now forced against a wall, the Petrai decided to up the stakes. See, deities at this point in time had been fairly present in the world. The World Serpent had granted so much power before to the Seroks, and the titans at this point in time as well had their own god, Anam the All-Father, which blessed his children with might and power, and the Petrai, on the other hand, as powerful spellcasters as they were, they did not have such divine support, and so they upped their ante and put their cards on the other side, so to speak. The Petrai started developing profane rituals in order to summon and free many of the primordials which had been imprisoned in the mythological war between the gods and the primordials. Now, exactly who was freed and how the war continued is still fairly unknown, and there's many different interpretations of how exactly things unfolded after this. Because as soon as many primordials started walking the planet, many deities suddenly got involved again, and also walked the planet as well, fighting them. Then afterwards, it is believed that one particular primordial, Asgorath, a draconic entity, decided to use its unimaginable power to sling a titanic moon or asteroid right onto the planet. Whether it did this to end the war or kill some deities or to destroy the planet, it's a bit unclear, but the event is called the Tearfall. When the asteroid fell into the planet, it effectively shattered the land, creating what we now call the Sea of Fallen Stars, which nowadays rests here. Now, the resulting apocalypse that fell upon the world after the Tearfall completely destroyed the Petrai civilization. Many of them were forced to use their powerful magics to abandon the planet and move towards other astral realities. Some others were forced to live underwater, eventually devolving into many of the amphibian monstrous races that we see today, but most of them simply died, and so the Petrai, as we know them, basically just went extinct. Now, the Forgotten Realms has one entity which we call the Overgod. We really know nothing about this individual other than the fact that he sort of rules over all of the gods and the primordials. He's sort of above all, but he doesn't really act. He behaves as an observer. basically. At least on most occasions, he only seems to act when he's forced to, and the events that resulted in the Tearfall forced his hand. This overgod, which we know is called Ao, decided to separate the planet into two forms. One which would be called Aber, and the other which would be called Toril. Aber was given to the primordials, while Toril was given to the gods. And so in this form, the war between the gods and the primordials would now finally cease. Now, the Forgotten Realms focuses almost exclusively on Toril and not on Aber, so we're not really going to cover Aber at all from now on. Also know that after the Tearfall, the supercontinent that was Miroboros was sort of split into now multiple continents. Further, the planet was also changed a bit when Ao separated it into two whole beings. Further, there are some events that will transpire later that will also shift it. But basically, this is how the planet looks now, and roughly has maintained this shape throughout the rest of its history. Now, there are books that cover most of these locations and continents, but honestly, about 100% of the content that you will be experiencing from Dungeons & Dragons will be said in this continent, which we call Phaerimm. So from here on out, for the rest of the video, we will focus on this particular continent. Now, something very interesting transpired. Again, whether this was intended for Masquerath or not, it turned out that dragons started appearing in the world. Many creation myths actually state that the moon that Ascarath plummeted onto the planet was in fact filled to the brim with draconic eggs, which detached from the moon and then fell like tiny meteorites all over the planet. And so, from this moment on, dragons would start appearing and, of course, start changing the fate of the world. It would only take 1,000 years or so before all of these dragons would start becoming adult and ancient dragons, powerful enough to shatter any semblance of status quo among the currently existing civilizations. The UNT were forced to retreat into their cities, losing to the awe-inspiring might of dragons. Similarly, the Aerie would easily fall to the dragons as well, previously being able to resist domination by the other creator races thanks to their ability to fly and build kingdoms in far-fetched locations, but now they could no longer hide, as dragons could fly as well and match them very easily in the air. A draconic superiority on the mainland was undisputed, except for one species that stood above the rest, the one species that had stood against the previous master of the world: the Titans and the Giants of the North. Unlike the UNT and the Aerie, who were puny compared to the dragons, the Titans were actually a match for them, both in size and in magical might. At the time, the Titans were at their apex in their kingdom that they called Ostoria, also called the Colossal Kingdom, which did spread quite far in the world. The dragons, of course, also were expanding quite rapidly, building their own cities and kingdoms. And so the inevitable clash between the two groups, of course, would come. However, it would last for at least 4,000 to 6,000 years before it would reach its conclusion. It was a brutal and bloody conflict, the two titanic races fighting against one another. It was so bad that this hatred that they had for each other would become a generational, almost foundational principle of the two, that these two species would have against the other. Even to this day, this hatred still runs in their blood. Giants hate dragons, and dragons hate them back. Now, many things happened during this time. See, during the Dragon and Giant War, the other races of the world finally got a chance to thrive unseen. Frankly, neither dragons nor the giants had any time to invest in subjugating any of the other races. They were frankly too puny and weak for them to worry about. The humans at the time were still in their infancy, not really ready to take over the world yet. Instead, the ones who would start taking advantage of the spirit of instability were the elves. See, we didn't really talk about one of the creator races. We sort of just brushed them aside, but the Fae do have a part to play in this story. See, the story goes that the Fae left the planet quite early on to go into the Feywild, this transitory adjacent realm that existed perpendicular to Toril, a planetary echo, if you will. What exactly is the Feywild? Again, does fall beyond the scope of this video, but the Fae made their kingdoms on this realm that bordered the material plane. And at this moment in the history of the planet, the Fae started opening portals from the Feywild and into Toril, and through these portals came the very first elves, creatures that had grown and evolved from the Feywild, who took advantage of the portals being opened in order to explore the world beyond. And so did the first elves make it onto the planet. Now, it did take quite a while for these elves to set up and start understanding the world and their magic again. This war between the dragons and the giants lasted for many thousands of years, and throughout this war, the dragons would cripple and limit the ability for elves and some of the other species to be able to really expand throughout the world. Now, I don't fully have the time here to delve into every single species that existed at this moment, but do know that there were a fair amount of them by now. We're told, for example, that one of the creator races had already opened up a portal in the mountains of the north, and from that portal came the first orcs, who were savage monsters suitable for warfare. We also know that the dwarves had spawned from the cavernous bowels of the planet and lived under the ground unmolested for millennia. We also had creatures like Nagas, who were created by the UNT. We had halflings, who always existed in the shadows of other races and never really accomplished anything grand. And of course, we have goblinoids and ogres and the like. But all in all, the dragons proved quite superior to everyone else, including the Titans. But they suffered from a massive rupture within their ranks, as unlike the unified deific pantheons of the giants, the gods of the dragons were split. This can happen when the gods that form a religious pantheon have no obvious true leader, but instead are a collection of powerful but equal gods. See, Annam, the Allfather, is the undisputed leader that governs the gods of the giants. He is the most powerful, and all of the gods under him just simply do as he says. And in turn, all titans and giants simply follow his commands. This was not true for dragons, who are by nature more individualistic. So what followed were the Holy Draco Wars, where religious factions within the Draconic Empire started forming and then, of course, fought each other. See, back then, dragons were incredibly religious. In fact, the main reason that they had even fought against the giants and the titans in the first place was because they were ushered to do so by the gods. Really, it was just a beef between the giant gods and the dragon gods that forced both groups to fight. Now, some of these religious differences were centered around what exactly was Askarath, and what exactly did Askarath want for the dragons. Other fights started because the new dragon gods were being spawned, and the younger generations of dragons were venerating them, while the older generations were sticking to the ancient gods. And then, of course, came Bahamut and Tiamat, who ended up becoming the most popular of the new brand of gods that were being created. Deities who hated each other and spurned their children to fight one another in their name. In summary, the dragons effectively crippled the empire of the giants and the titans, pushing them all the way to the north and almost destroying them in total, while their draconic empire weakened itself thanks to infighting and in the end forming two major factions of dragons. The chromatics, which were the black, blue, white, red, and green, versus the metallics, which were the gold, silver, bronze, copper, and brass dragons. Eventually, they did realize that religious fervor had caused their empire to crumble, and they did abandon their gods, but by that point, the empire had grown weak enough for the elves to strike. This would be the point where elves would take on a primary role on the world, and it would all start with a massive high elven spell that they would unleash upon the dragons. Before I go about what exactly that spell did, we should probably talk about magic in this world. See, the magic of this world comes from what we call the weave. The weave is this invisible force that exists everywhere, like a fabric that touches every living being, every rock, every fiber, every tree, and every grain of sand on the planet. When you cast a spell, you're grabbing a huge chunk of this weave and then brutally shifting it into a desired shape before you release it into your desired outcome. What spells are just ways in which you grab the weave and twist it to form shapes, but it's not a perfect science. The spells are really just approximations to desired outcomes. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a tranquil river that passes by a field. Now imagine that you want to water a beautiful flower that is about 10 feet away from the river. Casting a magical spell would be like grabbing a big chunk of water with your fist and then walking over to the flower and dropping the water on top of it. Doing it in this way is kinda crude, it's wasteful. Much of the water would seep out from your fists as you would try and grab it, and then some of it would also fall into the ground on your way to the flower. And then when you drop the water into the flower, it would drop in this kind of random shape and form, and it might damage the flower on the impact if you do drop too much water. However, doing it like this is fast, it's convenient, it's easy, anyone can do it. And this is how everyone has been casting magic up until now. The elves come from a different place, a place where abusing nature, abusing the world, and abusing magic is kinda frowned upon, especially so because in the Feywild, well, you could consider sometimes the land itself to be alive. But regardless, the elves were a lot more delicate with their magic, they were a lot more refined with their magic. And so with the help of their god, Corellon Larethian, they devised a different way to cast magic. Elvish high magic. This type of magic is extremely complicated, it's basically ritual magic. It takes a very, very long time to cast, oftentimes requires multiple casters working together at the same time, and that's only after many, many years of preparation. Some elvish high magics require centuries to learn. This is why other races never really managed to learn this type of magic. It just takes so long to learn and requires a cohesive group of casters all working together symbiotically to be able to be used. Now, let's go back to our river example. Whereas casting normal spells would be the equivalent of grabbing water from the river with your own fists, Elvish High Magic would be the equivalent of, say, carefully digging a small trench that leads the water from the river directly towards the flower. You know, it takes a long time to do, requires a lot of effort, might require a lot of help, and if you don't finish it, it was all wasted. You don't accomplish anything after all if the trench doesn't actually get to the flower. But it's permanent. You don't have to water the flower anymore, it's done. Forever. Further, if someone wanted to undo this effect, it would be really hard. You would have to start filling up the trench with more dirt. But that might leave patches of magic stranded in ponds. Also, there is a chance of catastrophic consequences. The water might completely drown the flower. The locations where you dug up the trench are basically unusable now, and if you reroute the river water too much, you might dry out certain locations on the river, creating untold chaos. All in all, Elvish High Magic is unbelievably potent and can accomplish things that people could only dream of, but it's very dangerous and can harm the world in a permanent way. Well, at the time, the dragons were a problem and the elves sought a solution. The elves devised a high magic spell called the Draco Rage Mythal, and the spell was tied to a star called the King Killer Star, which is basically a comet that becomes visible on the planet rarely every once in a while. The way the spell was formulated was such that every time that this comet would be visible from the planet, its magic would activate and its magic would make all dragons go mad. Quote, after years of secret research in the frozen north of Phaerimm and extensive debate about the costs and risks, the elves weaved the Draco Rage Mythal, a permanent crafting of elvish high magic, and one of the most powerful spells ever woven into the weave. This epic spell made it impossible for dragonkind to continue its collective dominion over Phaerimm. The Draco Rage Mythal caused all dragons, including those of type dragon and creatures with the dragon blood subtype, to become reckless and run amok across their lands, slaughtering their young and vassals and destroying all in their wake. But it also gave the fair folk the opportunity to break free of dragon rule, marking the denouement of the reign of dragons. As a result of this ancient curse, dragons have periodically gone berserk, rampaging across the realms. Like some sort of disease, the so-called Draco Rage, sometimes also known as the Dragon Rage or simply the Rage, lays dormant, erupting forth every several decades or even few centuries, and even seemingly associated with the reappearance of the King Killer Star, actually a bright red comet that winks like a baleful eye. to infect dragons for several 10 days at a time." End quote. This is, in some ways, one of the cruelest curses that has ever been wrought in the history of this planet. And from this moment, from the moment that this Draco Rage Mythal was created, dragons would never be able to construct or hold cities or have any semblance of society on this planet ever again. Because every single time that this star would show up in the night sky, dragons would be driven onto madness, to devour their very own children, to destroy the buildings that they have constructed, the cities that they have built, and slaughter any friends that they may have within reach. This destroyed dragons as a civilization forevermore. And upon the swift and universal destruction of their civilization, the elves rose up to claim the land for themselves. This epoch in time now we call the First Flowering, which was essentially the spreading and the domination of elves across the land. Many enormous kingdoms were made by all of the very different kinds of elves that existed at this moment, from the Green Elves to the Sun Elves, the Dark Elves, and Moon Elves. And then we would have the Crown Wars, which were the resulting battles and the wars between the elves. Now, this whole period is very long, longer than the rest actually. To put it into perspective, our story started in minus 35,000 DR when the Ice Age ended. DR is kind of like the Jesus moment of history, where modern civilizations started using that moment in time to start counting years forward. I will explain, of course, what that moment is once we get to year 0. But basically, everything that we have talked about so far lasted about 9,000 years in total. The rise and fall of the Seroks and the subsequent rise of the Petrai up until the moment that they summoned primordials and the Tearfall falls onto the planet. That whole section of history is called the Days of Thunder and go from minus 35,000 DR to minus 30,000 DR. Then the rise and fall of both of the Titans and the Dragons comprise what we now call the Dawn Age, which goes from minus 30,000 DR to minus 24,000 DR. And this age, the time of the Elves, both the First Flowering and the Crown Wars, go all the way from minus 24,000 DR to minus 9,000 DR. So overall, the time of the Elves lasts a very long time, and it actually lasts longer than this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we continue, I just want to take a minute here to tell you about my website, MrRex.store, where I have all kinds of Dungeons & Dragons supplements that you can use for your games. From monstrous classes, to packets with gold prices for all of the magical items in the game, to evil subclasses for all 12 classes in D&D, to even full-blown adventures. My full adventure, Sands of Doom, is finally out for print on demand. A massive campaign set in the deserts of Kyrat, where gnoll mummies and skeletal undead roam the dunes. Find the ancient hidden genies, defeat mighty sand krakens, explore the tiefling city of all Kyrat, and discover the dark secrets that the desert has to hide. With dedicated rules for making wishes, featuring the unbreakable laws of wishes, dozens of new stat blocks, dozens of powerful artifact level relics that you can find, and literally almost 50 different battle maps and locations, Sands of Doom is the book that I spent almost 2.5 years writing. I think it's amazing. You can get the PDF or buy the hardcover book at MrRex.store, or you can play it on Roll20 with a fully customized conversion specifically made for Roll20. Thank you all so much for the support. It is with your help that I can even run this channel and continue to bring you all of this awesome lore. Oh, and speaking of, even though this is not technically a new release, I still took the time to make a companion PDF for this video. For such was the dark pact that I made with you guys, to do one for each single release. So if you're interested in a breakdown for all of the eras for the history of the Forgotten Realms, make sure to check out my Patreon to get the companion PDF for this video, with a lot of what I cover on this video been put there in writing by me in a beautifully illustrated PDF. So thank you all so much, and sorry for all the yapping. Now, on to the video. The creation of the Draco Rage Mythal obliterated the Draconic civilization, one of the cruelest curses ever unleashed upon any group of people so far. There is another curse which we will talk about later, though ironically it was also unleashed by the elves. The Draco Rage Mythal was a permanent magical effect tied to an asteroid, which drove all dragons mad when the asteroid showed itself upon the sky. It was so effective that it alone destroyed the Draconic Empire. The rage forced dragons to consume their children, to destroy their cities, to fight their own allies, to throw themselves into murder and mayhem. A tragedy that perhaps could have been overcome if not for the fact that this was not just a one-time effect. Every single time the comet would pass through the planet, the Draco Rage would activate, ensuring that dragons would never own dominion over any kingdom, any city, or really hold any true gatherings forevermore. Dragons fought this, of course. A massive draconic attack was delivered onto the ritual site where the spell was originally cast, but thanks to the sacrifice of the Avariel, known as the Winged Elves, the dragons could not push through until it was too late. The spell took effect, but at a great cost. The Avariel, who would have normally been as populous as the rest of Elvenkind, were effectively driven to close to extinction, as every man, woman, and child fought for the protection of the Mythal. Then after that, one last-ditch effort was made by the Draconic Empire to dismantle this powerful magical curse, while they devised a spell that would send a ray of destruction directly towards the comet, in hopes of shattering the star itself. This was the brightest minds within the Draconic civilization gathering every bit of sorcerous power they had and putting it onto this one destructive spell. And the spell did work, though unfortunately for them, they missed. The dragons missed the comet and instead ended up striking the moon. The moon was blasted with tremendous magical power, shattering an enormous chunk of its edge and splintering it into pieces. Pieces that from that moment on would continue orbiting the planet right behind the moon itself. This we can see, even to this day. Every adventurer that plays in the Forgotten Realms, you right now who are playing in Storm King's Thunder or Waterdeep Dragon Heist, when you look up onto the moon, you will see a small collection of asteroids that follow the moon. The moon is called Selûne, and the asteroids are called the Tears of Selûne. What you see there in the night sky are the last memories of the ancient Draconic kingdom that existed 25,000 years ago. Quote, "In the desperate hope that another of Athgorath's children might chance upon my remains and seek what I have found, I now reveal my most precious piece of knowledge. The hills of the 7 lost gods are not what they first seem. Each of the 7 rings of standing stones date back to the last days of the reign of dragons, when the Elder Worms sought to reverse what the elves had wrought. My ancestors tried to focus the weave into a weapon of unparalleled might that could shatter the drifting stars into clouds of rubble in the heavens above. But they scored only a glancing blow on the moon that circles our world, leaving only a string of tears and an inland sea to mark their failure. Now reason is once again undone by rage, and all that dragons have wrought crumbles slowly into dust." End quote. The annihilation of the dragons and the slow crumble of the giant empire in the north allowed for the quick proliferation of the elves into the mainland in this new age that we call the First Flowering. This age starts at minus 24,000 DR, and the elves will experience unprecedented prosperity, power, and hegemony for a staggering amount of time. Other than some minor small confrontations between elves, there are no recorded major events from the beginning of their settling until about 7,000 years after. So it is 7,000 years of relative peace that the world gets from this time. But it's also worth noting that 7,000 years being a lot of time is really mostly from a human's point of of view, since in theory, 7,000 years is about 90 human lifetimes, but it's only like 9 elvish lifetimes. Things get interesting when you think about years in this way, because then you notice that the entirety of the Dawn Ages, when the giants and the dragons held dominion, that only spanned about 6,000 years, which is about 2 lifetimes for some of the more long-lived dragons. In any case, many big and influential elvish kingdoms were created during these 7,000 years. You have the Gold Elf Kingdom of Arivandar that was settled on what is nowadays the High Forest, a Moon Elf Kingdom of Ardeep around where the Greenfields are located now, a Dark Elf Kingdom called Ilithir scattered throughout what is nowadays the Shar and the Forest of Amtar. We have a Gold and Moon Elf Kingdom called Siorpir, and I'm sorry about these pronunciations, these are very elvish looking names. But these guys were located in present-day Ankwood and Condlewood. We have the Kingdom of Ilifarm, who settled around present-day Ardeep and Cryptgarden Forest, alongside many parts of the Desertification Valley. Then there's the Orishar Kingdom, by nowadays Duskwood and parts of the Shar. There is Thiarnitar, which is what is Thornwood today. There is Ieler by Winterwood. We have Meritar by what is now today the High Moor and Misty Forest. And then lastly, we have the Kingdom of Keltolmere, which is what is present-day Tethir, Amd, Erlasar, and Calimshan. But then at about minus 17,600 DR, hundreds of high mages assembled into the heartland of Phaerimm at the Gathering Place. In here, they convoked the most powerful magic that has ever been made. It's called Ever Sakatine, also known as the Sundering, and it was a high magic spell designed to create the prophesized holy home of the elves. This is at a time when the hubris of the elves was at their peak. They literally, not figuratively, but literally wanted a piece of heaven on this world that they could live in. We know that the actual casting of the spell involved 13 high mages, 12 of which would funnel their energies into the spell, and then you would have one central mage who would direct it. We know that the Dark Elves were not invited to participate, since at this point in time, there was a lot of animosity between the Gold Elves and the Dark Elves, and the Gold Elves had a lot of political power in the northern sections of the continent where the ritual was being prepared. And that is also compounded by the fact that not every elf wanted this spell to be cast in the first place, since many figured that the results would be catastrophic, and it is believed that many of the Dark Elves opposed the casting of the spell in the first place, whereas the Gold Elves were the ones that were suggesting it in the first place. But anyways, now this spell was so powerful that we don't even know today the full extent of its power and reach. We know that the land was sundered, with enormous pieces of the continent being erected out from the ground and then flung out towards the sea in order to build this magical island that the elves desired. We know that a piece of Arvandor, the heaven of the elves, was taken and deposited alongside the island. And we know that the Seldarine, which is the name for the elvish pantheon of gods, actually approved of this spell being cast. And in fact, the spell would have failed if it wasn't for the intervention of the elvish gods who helped finish the ritual to create this now holy island. What we don't know are the exact ramifications of the spell, because the spell was so powerful that its magic traveled backwards and forwards in time. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the high magic spell made it so that the island always existed. It made it so that reality fixed itself in such a way so that the island was always there from the very beginning of this planet's creation. And so there's a belief that the Sundering spell went backwards in time and affected the Tearfall and perhaps other events that transpired in the past, but also went forwards, affecting what we now call the Second Sundering, which is an event that transpired in the 1480s, but we will cover that once we get there. All in all, the fabled island of Evermeet was created. It was blessed by the elvish gods and would become a haven for all of the elves for the rest of time, but it did come at a great cost. Thousands of elves' lives were lost, many settlements were destroyed, and many sections of the world were starved for magic in order to move that magic all the way over to the island. Remember my analogy about magic in the world of the Forgotten Realms being like a river. that you can manipulate in different ways. Imagine taking enormous amounts of water from a section of a river and just dumping it somewhere else. The location where you're dumping it is now going to be blessed with inordinate amounts of magic, but then you're gonna leave other places on that river without the water, without the magic. This is actually believed to be what is causing a lot of places in the Forgotten Realms to grow these wild magic spots, or places where magic just simply does not function. But now, the hubris of the Sun Elves in particular would reach to even greater heights, as Gold Elves have historically always been elitist and arrogant. They've always seen themselves as superior even to the other elves. At least back then, this mentality was rampant during the height of the Arivandar kingdom of the Sun Elves. And with this hubris, they would start the chain of events that would lead into what eventually will become the downfall of the entire species. And they would do this through the annexation of the neighboring kingdom of Myritar. You see, Myritar was formed by groups of green elves and moon elves that were disillusioned with the way that the sun elves were running things in their kingdom of Arivandar. And as they left and formed this new kingdom, it started to flourish in such a degree that it was starting to outshine the sun elf kingdom where they originally came from. In fact, by about 4,000 years after the Sundering, Myritar had become the center of elven art and high magic in the entire continent. It all started with Arivandar attempting to peacefully annex Myritar using their political power, but then it further escalated into trade interferences between the two when the peaceful annexation just wasn't happening, which finally erupted into a straight-up invasion by Arivandar into Myritar, which concluded with Myritar being militarily occupied and forcefully annexed. There were also further threats at the time made by the Sun Elf Kingdom to another neighbor, the Kingdom of Chantal Othurier, basically threatening them to either join this Arivandar new forming empire or suffer a similar fate of annexation. Now, this invasion and annexation of Myritar we call the First Crown War, which will start a series of wars collectively called the Crown Wars, which basically forms the next era of the Forgotten Realms, and it lasts for a total of 3,000 years. So the Dark Elves at the time already very much not in favor of how the Sun Elves had been running things, basically declared war on the Sun Elves and their kingdom at this point. However, the kingdom of the Sun Elves was all the way in the north, and the kingdom of the Dark Elves was all the way in the south. And so it was supposed to be a battle strictly between two empires. Instead, it became the Second Crown War, which was the Dark Elves effectively just denouncing the Sun Elves and then attacking anyone who politically, economically, or militarily sided with the Sun Elves. Thankfully, we do have an official map for these wars, which is amazing, and this is the one right here. So here is the Unther Empire, the kingdom of the Dark Elves, and what they did was they invaded and quickly conquered Orishar, who at the time was a major trade partner to the Sun Elves. Then the Unther completely destroyed Siorpir using magical fire, which at the time would have been likely considered very much taboo because of the type of destruction that those magics create in the type of architecture that elves prefer, which of course is heavy in wood. In particular, they tactically burned out the entire frontier between Siorpir and its neighbors so that they couldn't get any help. The elvish realms of Thiarnitar and Yeller banded together to declare war on the Unther, claiming that they were fearing more the brutal tactics of the Dark Elves and their use of fire to create wanton destruction, more so than they feared the colonizing mentality of the Sun Elves on the north. And so they invaded the lands of the Unther, however they failed, and more than half of their forces were destroyed, claiming that the Dark Elves were using corrupt magic, though the nature of what this magic was, or where it came from at this point in time, was still unknown. Then Unther took over Yelir, using the same tactics of spreading fire in order to separate armies and prevent reinforcements, destroying miles and miles of forests. It is actually, by the way, why nowadays when you look at a map of the Forgotten Realms, you actually see that there's a lot less forests, especially where these kingdoms were located. So much of that was just annihilated by the Dark Elves. Now, at this point in time, you have to understand too that Myritar, far in the north, wasn't fully conquered yet. There were bastions of resistance still, cities that were still not fully taken, and so for all intents and purposes, there was still a war in the north, which, seemingly was prompting the Dark Elves to be brutal in their approach, since presumably they wanted to reach the north and help Myritar as fast as they could. Again, Myritar was one of the kingdoms here at this time epoch that held a large amount of Dark Elves. And so it was sort of like an emblem, a symbol of Dark Elves sort of superiority, or at least might and prestige. And so it completely getting taken over by the Sun Elves was just like a very personal insult to them. But after the fall of Yelir is when Myritar becomes fully conquered. And this is when things start to get dark, when the Dark Elves start delving deeper into brutality and, well, evil. When the Dark Elves of the Unther Empire conquer Thiarnitar, it does so using enslaved monsters and undead, some of which were dragons that had been mind-controlled and enslaved. And it does this in spite of the fact that the war in the north was already far over, and this conquering of Thiarnitar effectively ended the Second Crown War. Now, a couple of notes here. It is at this point in time when many elves who were seeking peaceful lands, or just generally a place to avoid all the war and bloodshed that had been happening all around the place, they started to abandon the mainland in order to go out onto the sea. And so this would be the time when we would start to see a lot of sea elves, many of which choose to live on the islands that we now call the Moonshays, and some of which start living underwater. This is also the time when some of the first mind flayers would start making their way over onto this planet. These mind flayers would come from a planet on the solar system called Glyth, which is the 6th planet from the sun. They travel to the planet Toril here and form a massive city called Orindol underground. But anyways, back to the elves. There's about 300 years or so of, I wouldn't call it peace, but rather reconstruction of forces, replanning, Cold War style preparations. This stalemate is then broken by the Sun Elves, who finally decide to invade Chantal Othrier, using the same script as before. Basically, they try to peacefully annex using politics, but when that failed, they would then resort to threats and then eventually war. This is what begins then the Third Crown War, which lasts for another 300 years before Arivandar, the kingdom of the Sun Elves, conquers Chantal Othrier. But then something weird happens. We call it the Dark Disaster. Myritar is engulfed in killing storms. Quote, regardless of which elf did what to whom, the killing storms known by elves as the Dark Disaster were summoned over Myritar 1,000 years after the first Vishan noble walked among its wooded glades as a conqueror. The Dark Disaster lasted for months, and when its cloying black and olive mists and ichor-choked rains finally dissipated, the One-Sprout realm stood revealed as an open, poisoned and blasted plain instead of a forest. While many of the folk of Myritar fled far before the killing storm, many innocents died in its fell wake. 90 Dark Elf wizards and a trio of high mages of Myritar chose to face it and fight. Though what became of them is lost, for they headed to the heart of the storm a month after its origin, seeking the place of power where they could cast a counterspell against the storm. Like all else within the storm's envelope, there was naught left behind to find but ash and ichor. End quote. It was clear to all elf that the Killing Storm was a high magic spell, but whoever had casted it, and for what purpose, is still unknown to this day. There are two possible culprits, or at least I would say, out of all of the theories, two stand out the most. The most popular theory is that the Sun Elves did it, whether it was because they were losing control of the kingdom, or perhaps they were testing a spell that they wanted to use against the Dark Elves and then backfired, or was maybe stronger than anticipated, is unknown. The other culprit could be resistance fighters within the kingdom who were attempting a spell that they could use against their oppressors, but again, backfired and then consumed them all. Regardless of who did it, it only took 3 months for the storms to destroy the entire kingdom, and what was left is what we now today recognize as the High Moor. This entire section here was forest, and one of the most powerful kingdoms of high magic and art that have ever existed in this world, and now this swamp is what was left. Myritar was, of course, a kingdom of dark and green elves, and of course, the reason why the dark elves had gone to war with the sun elves in the first place was because of this. And so, as of its destruction and the growing sentiment that the Sun Elves had done the high spell that had caused it, we see now the beginning of the Fourth Crown War. Finally, an actual confrontation between these two major powers. Now, the lore describes the Dark Elves at this point in time as seething from the destruction of Myritar, and at this point, at minus 10,450 DR, we got to see for the first time the truth of the corrupt magic that the Dark Elves had been using. It had seemed that the Dark Elves were convoking the power of mythical elvish deities that were forbidden. The peculiarities of the elvish deific pantheon land beyond the scope of this video, but know that one of the most powerful goddesses in the elvish pantheon betrayed Corlon Larithian, the patriarch of the pantheon, as she, who at the time was his wife, attempted to kill him to usurp his position. Now, that didn't work, and she was banished alongside a few other gods who sided with her. In this timeline, this would have happened around 20,000 years before all of these crown wars. Now, it is unclear whether the Dark Elves knew exactly who they were praying to or who was giving them their power. There are some sources that claim that they only knew them as some form of spider goddess alongside a small group of small deities that shared the sympathy of the Dark Elves. But of course, in reality, they were praying to this betrayer, a goddess named Lolth that had been banished from the Elvish pantheon, a goddess that was now a demon lord. Now, out of all of the other profane deities that they were praying to, there was also Gaunadar, who took a very explicit role in corrupting the Dark Elves, and that's exactly what happened. The Dark Elves started to become corrupted by these evil deities. Lolth and Gaunadar were using the civil strife between the elves as a way to ingratiate themselves onto the Dark Elves and use their anger and perhaps a genuine desire to help Myritar as a way to corrupt them. And so, during this Fourth Crown War is when you started to see demons being summoned by the Illithir. It's also likely that from the perspective of the Dark Elves, they had seen what the Gold Elves had potentially wrought upon Myritar with those killing storms, and they were afraid that the same thing would happen to them, which would further force their hand into committing grievous taboos in order to get the power that they needed to end the war in their favor. All in all, the war would last for another 450 years, and it would be an extremely bloody affair, as some of the lore suggests that the Dark Elves were actually winning, but it's a bit unclear, and we do know that most of Chantal Authrier was almost completely burned to the ground by the enslaved dragons and demons that the Dark Elves had been using. And so at this point, after basically hundreds of years of conflict, the general sentiment between all of the different elves started to shift, between who was good and who was evil. The atrocities of the Gold Elves and the fact that they had started this entire conflict in the first place was quickly being forgotten. And instead, everyone started to point their fingers at the Dark Elves who were using demons and fire and undead and of course now slaves, which was not an elvish thing at all to do. And what resulted was a miraculous collection of priests and high mages and most likely hundreds of thousands of citizens to gather in some of the more neutral kingdoms in order to pray to the elvish gods for salvation. And the gods responded. Brutally responded. By channeling his power through his clerics, Corlon Larithian used an extremely powerful high magic spell that cursed every single Dark Elf. The corrupted ones who were summoning demons and burning the forests, the soldiers that fought on the front lines, the priests that were healing the wounded, the druids that were taking care of the woods, the children that played in the parks, the very same clerics that had prayed for salvation originally, and even the unborn that still hadn't had a chance to life. every single dark elf, innocent or guilty, was cursed by Corlan Larethian. This immediately ended the Fourth Crown War and caused what we now call the Descent of the Drow. The curse had both physical marks but also metaphysical ones. What do I mean? Well, physically, the Dark Elves were cursed with an aversion to the sun, which forced them to abandon their lives and kingdoms and instead seek salvation within the dark confines of the Underdark, a collection of labyrinthine cave systems that existed under the ground. But further, the curse also became something of a deific decree, effectively severing the Dark Elves from the rest of their brethren, in a deep philosophical way, like their souls were no longer united as brothers. Now, they were something entirely different. For example, elves do not need to sleep. Instead, they meditate. And when an elf meditates, especially when they're young, so before they reach 100 years of age, they see glimpses of the elvish heaven, Arvandor. But further, meditating brings peace and tranquility. It brings calmness to the mind of an elf. This, in some ways, was a gift by Corlan to his children, but a gift that was taken from the Dark Elves. From this moment on, when Dark Elves' trance is just silence and darkness. Further, the name Drow was given to them, meaning traitor in Elvish, which inevitably over time shortened to simply Drow, which is what they're now called today. After the cursing and subsequent banishment of the now Drow from the surface, the Elvish gods then summoned a great meeting of all of the Elvish leaders from all across the continent to form peace amongst the elves. In these conversations, it was then decreed that the ones guilty for starting this conflict were indeed the Sun Elves from the kingdom of Arivandar, and so, with one last divine command, many of the neutral smaller kingdoms of the elves banded together to form one last Fifth Crown War to bring the Sun Elves, who had perpetrated all of these crimes, to justice. The war, alongside many revolts from the Sun Elf kingdoms, led to the swift and decisive fall of Arivandar. And this puts us at minus 9,000 DR, or about 10,500 years before the present time. And the dissolution of Arivandar also marks the end of the era now known as the Crown Wars, and also marks the beginning of a new era called the Founding Time, which signals the rise of all kinds of humanoid civilizations, including the first big human civilizations. Most of the Elvish kingdoms laid destroyed after the Great Crown Wars, mere mockeries of the great power they once held, but none more so than the Empire of the Illithir. As Corlan's curse spread through the Dark Elven communities scattered across the globe, every single Dark Elf was forced to abandon the sun-filled lands up above and instead escape into the dark-filled caverns of the Underdark. It only took 2 months and all of the Illithir cities were abandoned. Not a single Dark Elven soul was left up above. This unbelievably large migration of creatures ended up creating one of the biggest shakeups in the world's history. See, the Empire of the Illithir laid in a large area that we call the Shar, but underneath the Shar was an entirely different group. A group that had laid unbothered, unmolested for thousands of years. These were the Dwarves. The Dwarves had a great kingdom only known as Berindon. Now, not much is known about this particular kingdom, but it is believed to have been their very first racial kingdom, and it sprawled quite far, stretching for most of the Shar. Now, the reason why we don't know much about this place, or why there's really no history left of these individual dwarves, will become apparent soon. See, this is the tragic reality of the circumstances that followed from the descent of the Drow. the now cursed Dark Elves, known now as the Drow, had to go into the Underdark, as the powerful curse inflicted upon them made the sun painful to them. But right underneath them were the dwarves, who now were being surrounded by running Dark Elves from the north, south, east, and west. And you must also understand, these Drow, even though they were cursed, they were still basically the most powerful empire on the planet at the time. They had the control of demons, a powerful, legendary, magical warfare designed for destruction, and they had been warring now for thousands of years. The Dark Elven culture at the time was a warring culture, and they were ready to fight. The Dwarven kingdom, on the other hand, was not, and they weren't prepared for this. The Drow absolutely annihilating them, taking control over the kingdom of Verinden for themselves. Now, thankfully, about 2,000 years prior, the dwarves had birthed a visionary who dreamed of creating their own kingdom in a far-flung location. His name was Tark Shanat, known as the Crusader, and he took his clan and a large number of dwarves on a settling expedition and settled on an area right underneath what is now Am, Tethir, and Calimshan. It had been successful, and they had been growing for quite some time now. So when Verinden was crushed and the dwarves were forced to abandon their homes and run for their lives, they had this new area to settle in and learn from their mistakes. This new kingdom was called Shanatar, and they would end up becoming a more defensible, more war-minded civilization thanks to the warnings given to them about these new evil creatures called Drow that had been invading the caverns of the Underdark. Now, the Drow would inhabit Verinden for a while, but as fate would have it, for an unknown reason, the cavern ceilings would all end up collapsing years later, effectively obliterating the kingdom and many of the Dark Elves within it. And with that, considerably weakening the power of the Dark Elves and also deleting the much beloved capital city of the dwarves to be forgotten forevermore. Now, the dwarves would come back later and resettle it and attempt to restore its former glory, but it would never reach the full size that it would have had in the past. Now, the dwarves that were originally from the city and would come back to restore it would be known as the Gold Dwarves, and they still live there to this day. In fact, I believe this would be the biggest concentration of pure dwarves in the Forgotten Realms today. They live in what is now known as the Great Rift, with cities both above ground and underground. Now, you should know, when the dwarves lost Verinden originally, not everyone went to Shanatar. The Great Migration went in many different places. Most famously, you have the dwarves that ended up in Chult, known as the Wild Dwarves, and those that went far north, known as the Arctic Dwarves. Anyways, the dwarves that originally left Verinden and founded and stayed in Shanatar would then be known as the Shield Dwarves, and these guys are fairly important. At least, I should say, there is a lot of stuff that happens to these guys. See, Shanatar wasn't just a single entity, but really 8. The 8 sons of Tark Shanatar each developed their own kingdom, each following the tenets of one particular dwarvish deity, so the ideologies of each kingdom sometimes conflicted with those of others, which ended up causing infighting among the dwarves of Shanatar. The first such civil war was called the Spawn Wars. It had seemed that a group of creatures that was found near where Shanatar was formed was a group of monsters called the Deep Spawn. These bizarre creatures, when they ate a person, they could birth a perfect replica of the person they ate. As the creatures were tamed and controlled by the dwarves, they started infighting by using replicas of one another, in essentially what ended up forming something of a Clone Wars. Quote, "Today I slew my twin brothers 7 times and nearly died 4 times at the hands of my twins. What kind of war is this that we replicate ourselves time and again, only to waste our own lives on axe blades dulled by endless intermissine fighting? Which one of us represents the hopes and dreams of our shared parents? Is it truly death if I am reborn time and again? Am I more worthy of living, or is my twin? Might we not ally ourselves, despond against the firsts, who recline on golden thrones, stirring themselves only to order us into fratricide?" Could we not reunite our lifeblood in some way other than slowly expiring together on some nameless cavern floor? Who are our gods? Have the Morning Salmon truly abandoned us, that they allow brother to slay brother in their name? I fear the children of Moradin are growing weak through self-inflicted wounds, and soon the spiders will be spinning their webs in the hollow husks that once housed our souls. Perhaps we are no longer even dwarves. When a work of art is copied, and that copy is copied again and again, the results become gross parodies of the original. I fear that I am but a pale imitation of the first I once was, willingly killing myself in an absurd parody of narcissism. By the axe I live, and by the axe I fear. I am already dead. End quote. The Spawn Wars would end thanks to a Drow invasion, which forced the Drow kingdoms to unite in order to fight. These were then called the Spider Wars, which went back and forth throughout the course of 3 wars that ended in something of a stalemate. Later, the powerful Mind Flayer city of Orindal would start a war with the dwarves as well in what would become the Mind Stalker Wars, or the War of Cloven Thoughts as it was known to the Mind Flayers. The dwarves also persevered on this defensive war against the Mind Flayers. However, as the war ended, the dwarves found out that one of their kingdoms had disappeared in the aftermath. See, the kingdom of Barakuir was cut off early on in the war, and when the war ended, the whole kingdom was just empty. Clan Duergar, who were the masters of this great city, were just all gone. The Mind Flayers had taken them, and throughout the next thousands of years, they experimented on them, abused them, and performed macabre breeding programs on them to change them to suit their needs. Those dwarves would end up becoming the Deep Dwarves, also known to everyone else as the Duergar. These dwarves had been changed, and were now very different. Their joy had been eliminated, their sense of pride removed. It would take the Duergar 4,000 years to escape enslavement, eventually succeeding and building their own cities and civilization, though a civilization opposed to the rest of Dwarven kind, because there was a deep-seated hatred and resentment that would be formed by the Duergar, feeling that the other dwarves had abandoned them to torture and aberratic service. They would become one of the greatest enemies of Dwarven kind in the world. The kingdom of Shanatar, however, would grow quite drastically, eventually even expanding above ground in the areas of and Tethir, then creating sub-kingdoms far and wide, all scattered across Phaerimm, specifically around the areas of the north. These sub-kingdoms would not be directly connected to Shanatar, but were more efforts by the Dwarvish kings to expand Dwarvish influence as far as they could reach, though most of these kingdoms would end up destroyed over time or conquered by other civilizations. Some notable examples are the Sundering Empire, which formed all across the north, basically all of the different Dwarven cities and forts found on the Silver Marches, and around these areas here are remnants of the powerful Old Kingdom, including of course the famous Mithril Hall. The kingdom inevitably fell to Orcs of the Mountains, and of course a mysterious group of creatures which we will talk about later. Other examples of Dwarvish kingdoms that came out of Shanatar were the Basilmer in the area known today as the Desertification Valley, Ogrim in the Fields of Tom, and then Amarindar in the Grey Peak Mountains, with Amarindar being one of the longest lasting ones, passing by relatively unscathed throughout this age and on to the next. Now, everything that I have talked about on this video so far is but only one of the many civilizations that sprawled out during this age. The founding time, also known as the Age of the Proud Peoples, spanned minus 9,000 DR all the way to minus 3,000 DR, and there's a lot of stuff that happens, but also stuff that happens scattered all throughout the map at different intervals within this timeline. The story of the dwarves is of course fairly important overall, at least at a high level. Delving any deeper than this is probably unnecessary for the purposes of this video series, but yeah, I will be jumping back and forth within the timeline a bit just so that I can cover topics from start to finish without having to jump around too much. Overall though, here on the screen is the rough timeline of some of the things that I have talked about already about the Dwarvish ascension so that you can see how they changed throughout the years. We're told that the height of Dwarven power in the Forgotten Realms was at the year minus 5,600 DR, where they were the biggest and most powerful, or rather that was where they were at their biggest before they started to decline. Now, something did happen to the main Shanatar Empire, but we will touch on it in a bit. For now, let's move across the globe, far to the east, through the Lake of Steam and through the Shar, until we arrive to the very edge of the continent of Phaerimm. Further, we will go back in time a bit to the beginning of the founding time. The year would be minus 8,350 DR, and the humans of the Roaring Plateau have just discovered agriculture, or better put, they have stopped being hunter-gatherer tribes and have begun to create permanent settlements. This is the beginning of what will become the Imaskar Empire, or the very first human empire in the Forgotten Realms. The empire will last until minus 2,488 DR, so almost 6,000 years, and the empire at its height would span from the Great Ice Sea to the Golden Water, and from the Elamber Sea to the Katakoro Plateau in Karatur, only to be destroyed in, oh man, the coolest way possible. So, the early warlords of the ancient Imaskar Empire were masters of transdimensional magic. How exactly they became so good at it is quite unknown. However, there are a lot of allusions that they had either uncovered or had been guided by Batrachi technology. If you remember, the Batrachi were the second empire to have ever risen in this world back in the days of Thunder at the beginning of time on this planet, and they were particularly known for summoning ancient primordials onto the world. Some of that technology must have found their way to the Imaskari, who used it to great effect. The reason they managed to spread so far and create such a vast empire so fast was thanks to, one, the Dark Elves of the Shar being no more, so they basically had nothing to fear from this entire section of the world, and two, they created powerful gates that would allow entire armies to pass through from one side of the empire onto the other, something that even to this day is incredibly difficult to do. And of course, those gates were, in particular, Batrachi technology. Now, after reaching its height, however, a series of misfortunes would befall the empire. About 2,000 years into the empire's growth, a massive and sudden Krakensua attack would destroy the capital city, splintering the empire into two major regions, Upper Imaskari and Lower Imaskari. And then, 2,000 years later, quote, in minus 4,370 DR, a devastating plague racked Lower Imaskar, beginning the period of Shartra, which means darkness in the Imaskari tongue. Ailing citizens flocked to temples throughout the empire, but their priests could not cure the plague. Even more mysteriously, a blight killed most of the empire's crops, bringing famine to the few who had survived the plague. The impact of this so-called silent death was catastrophic. Even the most lightly affected areas, 15 to 20% of the population died. Impoverished and isolated, Lower Imaskar survived the following decade only because of the weakness and misfortunes of its enemies. In their bitterness, the people turned against their gods, and most priests were slain or driven into exile. Though the Silent Death did spread north into the region known today as the Endless Wastes, Upper Imaskar remained safe and untouched. End quote. This is where things get crazy. So, the current Lord Artificer, which was the term given to the magical ruler of Imaskar, devised a plan to create two new Bukhara spires. Those were the famous teleportation gates of the Empire. Except that instead of connecting two locations within the Empire, they would connect this world with another. They went and opened up these portals to Earth. Yes, literally. Planet Earth. But then it gets pretty dark. So they did this to kidnap tens of thousands of people from the planet Earth in order to enslave them here in the Imaskar Empire. And specifically, they chose planet Earth because they saw that the art, which is the term that we use for magic, was not known on the planet, which meant that Earth was basically defenseless. I say basically because in this multiverse, gods are of course very much real and very much powerful, including the gods from Earth. And so, as the Imaskari kidnapped and enslaved humans from Earth, they would then quickly close those portals and create dimensional barriers to prevent the gods from these people that were enslaving to follow them. Now, the people kidnapped were both Egyptian and Mesopotamian, though they would eventually intermarry with the peoples of Imaskar to form their own unique ethnicity. In any case, the slave labor brought in unprecedented prosperity to the kingdom, allowing both Lower and Upper Imaskar to unite again. It is at this time, at around minus 4,000 to minus 3,000 DR, when the Shadow Plane would be discovered by one of the two best artificers of the Empire, Madriok, who would go on to use it for evil, only to be stopped by the other powerful archwizard, Hilithur, who by then was a hero and one of the most powerful wizards in the world. So then, how does this thriving empire suddenly end? Well, the freaking Egyptian and Sumerian gods show up. It had taken the avatars thousands of years of traveling through the multiverse before they finally arrived here on this planet, and they were pissed. All this time, the violent abuse and torture of the Egyptian and Sumerian people had not gone unnoticed. They had been praying for hundreds of years for salvation from this torment, and one of the greatest slave rebellions was about to unfold. Quote, the Imaskar civilization came to a violent end in minus 2,488 DR. Unbeknownst to the Imaskari, the gods of the Mulan had finally heard their people's prayers. Bypassing the Great Planner seals, these gods sent powerful avatars of themselves through the empty void of space to Toril. Upon their arrival on the peaks of Calimshan, these powers quickly descended into the Roaring Plateau, building an army and fomenting rebellion as they passed. Within 10 days, most of the Empire's major cities had been sacked. The final confrontation occurred on the palace steps of Inupris, between Lord Artificer Yuvarach and the Mulan god Horus, who emerged victorious. End quote. There is, of course, much more that happens after this with the people now known as the Mulan, which were the new ethnicity that I mentioned that was formed. But remember, this video only covers the founding time, and technically the founding time ends at minus 3,000 DR, but I went a bit further for you guys there to at least finish that story. It does get even crazier though. Oh, and right before the fall, the great archwizard Hilithur would escape the wrath of the deities by hiding in a secret stronghold in the mountains and entering temporal stasis. He, of course, later on becomes Halaster Blackcloak, the creator of Undermountain, the greatest dungeon in the world right underneath Waterdeep. And of course, an important character in this adventure, though I suppose that is a story for another day. But anyways, ancient Imaskari was the first, though it certainly would not be the last of the great ancient human civilizations. A group of humans would settle on the southern shores of the Sea of Fallen Stars by around minus 5,800 DR, led by a powerful psionic warrior known as Hram. He would settle this city, and from it, a burgeoning civilization would eventually sprout known as Yamdath, which would cover a fairly decent area from the north side of the Lake of Steam all the way to about what is now the Condlewood. This was a fairly powerful psionic civilization, though its role in history wasn't quite as important, other than the fact that they basically curtailed the expansion of another humanoid civilization rising from the west. Which moves us over here. See, in the area now known as Calimshan, Thethir, and Am, lots of stuff happens. We already talked about the Dwarven Empire of Shanatar that grew tremendously from down below, but to catch you up on other events, in here, if you remember, there was one of those ancient elvish empires, one that was called Keltormir, who had stayed neutral in the Great Crown Wars. Well, the dragons, who had been completely decimated by the elves, finally took revenge, at least the ones on this region. On a massive flight of red dragons, they attacked Keltormir in force. Quote, After an attack by a flight of red dragons on the center of the Great Elf Forest of Keltormir, the dragon's fire sparked a forest fire that raged out of control. This fire extinguished 4 entire clans of elves, 11 giant settlements, at least 4 green dragons, and thousands of square miles of woodlands. The once unified elves of Keltormir splintered into a number of separate clans. Due to fire sundered and otherwise ravaged homelands, Keltormir dissolves into 3 separate forests: the Wormwood, Darthirwood, or present-day Forest of Myr, and the Forest of Tethir." End quote. These elves basically either migrate outwards or become small clans that simply exist without much force in the region. By now, the Empire of Shanatar is still down below, and the land here is basically ripe for the taking, though the dwarves would not be the ones to move in first. That would come later. First came the genies. A powerful Jinn would find Phaerimm and claim this land right here as its own. He would arrive with armies of genies and thousands of humans and halfling slaves. The Jinn was called Calim, who would then build a great city called Calimport. This genie was unimaginably powerful. In fact, the dragons that destroyed Keltormir would come back to also destroy Calimport, and they would succeed, though after a century of warfare, Calim, the Jinn, annihilates every single dragon within the Marching Mountains, which is where they were lairing, and then he uses his genie magic to regrow Calimport in only a year. Now, things, however, would get hectic in the genie world as word of this world would have started to spread among the elemental planes as other genies would then start to arrive. One of them most notably being Memnon, who would settle in the lands north of Calimport by what is now Tethir and Am. Memnon was a formidable Ifriti with an army of fire, and both genies would eventually clash for dominion over the region. Their fights were so messed up that they would eventually create what is now known as the Desert of Calim. Just magic basically obliterating the earth, creating a massive desert. It is said that their battles, which by the way lasted for 400 years, were cataclysmic, as in they were simply destroying the land permanently. Again, the Desert of Calim being an example of the permanent devastation that they were creating that still lasts to this day. It got so bad that the elves were forced to intervene again, using high magic to settle it. They effectively imprisoned both genies in an escapable magical prison, disembodying their bodies into the elements, with Calim being disembodied onto the sky and Memnon into the earth. The remaining genies that existed within the area, albeit still fairly powerful and a strong army, they were then further defeated by an alliance of the dwarves of Shanatar down below, which, remember, they were incredibly strong at the time, and the freed human slaves that escaped amidst the chaos of Calim and Memnon being imprisoned. The alliance persevered and all of the genies were defeated, though this friendship between the escaped humans and the dwarves would not last long. The humans would take control over the lands south of the Marching Mountains, while Shanatar would take control of the lands north. An unfortunate incident, however, would spiral between the two, the humans and the dwarves, a few thousand years later, as human tomb robbers would be killed trying to enter dwarven sacred tombs. The unfortunate part, though, was that one of those tomb robbers happened to be the heir to the throne of the now human Calimshan. The political ramifications were unavoidable, and the Dwarven Kingdom of Shanatar and the human kingdom of Calimshan then were forced to basically go to war. This war would last 3,000 years, so it was a fairly slow-moving war, at least by human standards. In fact, it's crazy just how long this war lasted, especially so as the dwarves in High Shanatar were also fighting a massive war with giants all across their holdings, which allowed the humans to gain a lot of ground. It all ultimately ended in a decisive battle at around minus 2,600 DR, when the last dwarves of Upper Shanatar would fall to the might of Calimshan, which would force the dwarves to then seal the last remaining tunnels leading to Deep Shanatar, where the bulk of their empire was located. Calimshan also had aspirations to expand further onto the east, but they had been stopped again by the Psionic Empire of Yamdath, which would keep them at bay. And that's basically that. The founding time, as the name implies, was a moment in the history of the Forgotten Realms where many different empires and kingdoms would be formed, all thanks to the elves losing control over many parts of the world. The elves, of course, were still very strong, but severely weakened from their warring and mostly collected onto the northern sections of Phaerimm. The Elven Court, which was the location where the Elvish gods convened to figure out what to do about the Crown Wars, had become the center of Elvish civilization in the area that we now call Cormanthyr, with other Elvish kingdoms again still looking pretty strong, such as the Kingdom of Ilefarn in the Sword Coast and Irland in the north of the High Forest. We also had the famous city of Evereska that was formed in secret and hidden, which became a powerful congregation of Elvish power in the region. Most of the elves during the founding time were basically focused on fighting orcs that would come down from the mountains sporadically throughout the era, including many powerful warbands from the spine of the world. This time epoch is also characterized by the rise of the dwarves and their dominion and expansion over many of the lands in the world, until the end of the era, by which time their empire enters into stagnancy and decay. It is also characterized by the beginning of the rise of humans, with Imaskari splintering into what will become two new empires, which we will talk about on our next video, and with Calimshan growing into a massive force to be reckoned with on the west. But it is at the end of the founding time when the most memorable and most impactful kingdom that this world will ever see will start. Right at the end of this era, at around minus 3,500 DR, a small collection of villages will band together in a remote but relatively fertile area east of the High Forest and west of Cormanthyr. In what is now the massive desert of Anauroch, back in the day it wasn't a desert, but the birth rock of Netheril. 99% of spells that you use in Dungeons & Dragons comes from Netheril. Most random magic items that you find scattered around in the world probably come from Netheril. The reason the goddess of magic banned the use of spells higher than 9th level was because of Netheril. This very small collection of villages will radically shift the world order and enter us into the Age of Humanity, which pans from minus 3,000 DR to 1,000 DR. So on our next video, we will cover how humans effectively begin just dominating the world. We will cover not only Netheril, the Empire of Magic, but also what happens after the Egyptian and Sumerian gods destroy ancient Imaskar. We will cover how humans and elves settle their differences, and also we will touch on what happens when we finally reach Year Zero, when the Dale Reckoning calendar finally starts. The Age of Humanity spans the years minus 3,000 DR to 1,000 DR, and this is the era that comes right before the one that we call the present era, which starts at 1,000 DR and basically continues up until nowadays, which right now should be about 1492 DR. If you're curious about the time in which the pre-made adventures that you're playing are set, you can usually check out this information in the very first pages of many of the modules. You'll find that most of them are set between 1485 to 1492. But now, the Age of Humanity is the most complicated era out of all of them because we have the most information about this era than we have about any other. As it would make sense, the farther you go backwards in time, the more sparse specific information gets, and the more general that history becomes. For example, in the Days of Thunder and the First Flowering, we would skip sometimes thousands of years between meaningful events. Now, we're basically only skipping decades sometimes. That means that more so than before, I will have to be fairly general in how I explain things, lest we end up making 10 videos just for this one era. We're gonna have to suffice with only 2 instead. I am going to do my best. But today we're going to start with Netheril, which is by far the most momentous of all of the events in this era. If you look at this map, you will see the enormous desert of Anauroch. That desert used to not be there. Instead, this zone was actually fairly fertile, but the land was generally considered to be unlivable by both elves and dwarves. You see, dwarves prefer mountains and the underground, of course, whereas elves prefer forests. You know, the Dark Elves did utilize a lot of the open land back in the day, but they are no longer a concern since they were ushered down into the darkness of the Underdark by, of course, the Drow curse. So this open stretch of fertile land instead became the domain of a group of humans who settled fishing villages around what was then a pretty big lake called the Narrow Sea. The villages prospered and even united together for defense against the orcs of the area. In fact, more than once, these humans would even help the elves nearby in fighting the orcs, which formed a pretty good alliance between those elves and the humans. The elves were from the elvish kingdom of Ireland, who at the time were settled around the area known today as the Desertification Valley and the north of the High Forest. They were very strong but found use in these humans who reproduced really fast and had good fighting capabilities that could be used against the orcs. In particular, it had seemed that these humans had a proclivity for magic, and so the elves taught the humans magic so as to better fight the orcs. The humans had a shaman king called Nether, which is where the name Netheril comes from, as he named the small kingdom, of course, based on his name, as people do. Now, within the next 300 years of this new kingdom, two very interesting things happen. One is a mysterious lich-like creature appeared, which began courting the Netherese. The creature will be forthwith known as the Terraseer, named so because he appeared to have knowledge of the far past, of many locations in the present, but also he possessed even knowledge of the future. He would show up a few times during the Netherese history to basically just guide them, to tell them about things that they ought to do, and also to warn them of impending danger. This creature, in reality, was an ancient Sarok lich. If you guys remember, Saroks were the very first species that became sentient and developed enough on this planet to the point where they basically conquered the whole planet before they fell apart. What his angles were, this lich, or what he wanted, was never really made known, and it's actually one of the most mysterious figures in the world of the Forgotten Realms. But the second very interesting thing to happen to this small kingdom was the discovery of the Nether Scrolls. The Orcgate Empire, back in its heyday, controlled the whole world, and they unified all of their magical knowledge onto a series of 50 powerful scrolls. They call the scrolls the golden skins of the world serpent. However, they will be henceforth be known as the Nether Scrolls for all of the things that the Netherese will be able to do thanks to these scrolls. The scrolls were found in ancient Arivandar ruins in the High Forest. Arivandar was the ancient kingdom of the Gold Elves that stirred the whole Crown War debacle thousands of years prior. Now, the elves had decided to forbid colonization of the High Forest in remembrance of the Crown Wars, but the Netherese went in and effectively looted the scrolls. With some help from the Terraseer, the scrolls were translated, and immediately they set out to uncover their dark secrets. The magical power of the scrolls were so potent that the Netherese ended up abandoning the elvish magic of the Ireland elves in favor of those found on the scrolls. And to give you some context as to how powerful these spells are, or really how world-changing they can be, we can use an actual example of the sort of spells that are found within. We know, for example, of two scrolls, one of which holds the knowledge of the spell Awaken, and the other of a spell that never quite, thankfully, I would say, became well known, which is the Alter Beast spell. See, Awaken, as you know, is unbelievable, as it grants sentience to any beast or plant. You can make a boar suddenly become intelligent enough to reason, to logic, and even to speak. This, of course, as you can imagine, would have tremendous world-changing implications. If only the beast could reproduce and carry on those genes to its offspring, that would be incredible, but of course, they can't. That is, unless you use the Alter Beast spell. Alter Beast allows a wizard to modify the genetic makeup of a beast, to put it quite simply. Though the term beast in this context applies to every single type of creature. See, know that this spell was created by the Seroks, who viewed anything that is not a Serok as a beast, because of course they saw everyone else as inferior, and so that's why they named it such. But this spell works on every single creature. You can make literally anything happen by modifying the genetic makeup of creatures, from having a human grow 2 heads, to creating a combination of a dragon, a lion, and a goat, to even creating your very own custom species, and then modify them to suit your needs, such as making them docile, or even better, making it so that they are genetically predisposed to obey you. This, in fact, is how the Seroks created the Yuan-Ti and the Nagas, and they were attempting to create a servitor race that would work for them, and of course, they succeeded. In the case of Alter Beast, because you're changing the genetic makeup, if you were to have the newly created specimen mate with another such similar specimen, you would have them breed true, effectively creating a full new species of creature. This is magic that was prevalent back in the days of Thunder, and it's actually what created the vast majority of the species that you see nowadays walking around the world. In any case, combining Alter Beast with Awaken allows you unparalleled control, and to some degree, some might even say to take on the role of God. But again, this was just an example. This is merely a taste of the type of power that you would find on a Nether Scroll. World-changing magic, and the Netherese had them now. Back in the day, the Gold Elves were afraid of using this power, and so they never touched it, but the Netherese were not quite that careful. With this magic, one of the most powerful wizards that will ever be created, Iolaum, created the first Mythalar. A mockery, really, of the mythos of the elves, but very much functional and not that dissimilar in power. The Mythalar looked like a giant crystal ball of light. Its power seeped deep into the weave of magic of the world and practically functioned as a form of never-ending battery. See, traditionally, a magic item creation was extremely taxing. It just takes a lot of magical power. It takes a long time to accrue the magic necessary, and oftentimes it required even the very essence of the wizard in order to be done. Modern magic nowadays uses expensive material components in order to offset some of this, but the Netherese were able to simply use the infinite mana of the Mythalar in order to literally just do everything. Mages didn't need complex rituals in order to access the weave anymore. Further, they didn't need to use any of their essence or hold concentrations or use any material components. They didn't need to do anything. The Mythalar was a source of infinite power that was just so easily tapped. Further, the Netherese Arcanists developed spells higher than 9th level, generally considered to have been close to impossible before because of just how much mana was needed. Up until now, you either required dozens of mages, like in the case of the elves who would cast high magic in this way, or you needed to be a being physically made out of magic. Like, for example, the genies who could tap on their inordinate amounts of magic. We also know, for example, that the ancient dragons are able to do this as well, since their energy capacity is beyond what normal humanoids can muster. Inferno, for example, which we covered on our Dragon series, does have spell slots of 10th level and higher. But this restriction was no longer a problem, and so spells of 10th and 11th level were designed. Spells that were so potent that their areas of effect encapsulated sometimes entire cities or even the whole kingdom. Iolaum designed an 11th level spell to shear off an entire massive mountain, and then used 2 other spells, one to levitate the mountain and the other to shift gravity, in order to twist the mountain upside down so that the tip was pointing down and the sheared off plane base was pointing up, so that he could then live on top of this now floating mountain. He could just build his fortress, his tower on top. He did so in an effort to stop having to worry about orcs and other denizens who kept on invading the kingdom, and it worked wonderfully, actually. Highborn and powerful arcanists started to migrate onto his floating city, which resulted in Yolaum helping other arcanists in creating their very own floating enclaves. This, of course, resulted in the empire of floating cities called the Netherese enclaves, where each floating city was basically governed by a powerful archmage. In any case, the Netherese Empire exhausted most of the knowledge they could from the scrolls, creating hundreds and hundreds of different spells, many of which would become famous and spread across the world. And they would also create magic items for virtually any mild inconvenience. They had fridges in the Empire. They had light posts everywhere. They had magical purses for almost any citizen. It was a magical revolution, though of course it was all tied to the Mythalar. Without the Mythalar, many of these magic items would simply cease to work, since they were designed specifically to grab their magic from the Mythalar. Though, of course, not all was sunshine and rainbows. This was a strict libertarian-style semi-democracy where anything and everything goes. And when it came to expanding knowledge and advancing magic, no stone was left unturned. There were many, many cruel tests on creatures in order to study them. The weave of magic of the world was taxed and destroyed in many ways, and portals to dangerous places were opened. The lore even states that the Netherese even attempted to invade the Outlands, a section of one of the heavens, but well, of course were defeated by incredibly powerful planar creatures. One of the most horrid actions that they took, however, was the mass enslavement of the gnomes. Many people don't actually know this. It was so bad that it is said that the elves and the dwarves worked together in order to create what became the Trail of Mists, which was a secret endeavor to free many of these gnomes from the Netherese, until the pressure was so great from the other civilizations that they basically released the gnomes about 1,000 years after the initial enslavement. It was just so awful. The gnomes would migrate east and form their own city right here, where they still lay hidden up to this day. They have casted an enormous magical illusion to basically hide themselves from the world. Here is an excerpt written by a gnome child slave during the height of Netherese cruelty. Quote, Tarsak 15. I am tired of living like a mole in a musty burrow. It doesn't matter anyways, our deep wardens are dead, and we have no place to go. The Talls came again. They killed Borrower Great Torm with crackling light, while she tried to protect us with her pickaxe. They took aunt and uncle just by waving their hands. Papa says we must pray hard to Garl, and I have, but it hasn't worked. The Talls keep coming back and taking people away. I think Garl is mad at me, but Papa says that cannot be. Well, Sabruin, Garl. Tarsak 18. We have been running through the deep tunnels for days. I am sorry I cursed Garl, but I don't know what else to do. My coming of age was supposed to be next year, but it will probably never happen now. Tarsak 21. Today I saw aunt and uncle and some others that had been taken, but they didn't look much like themselves. Their skin had grown warts and turned sallow. Their hair had turned red, and their arms had become long and gangly. Aunt cackled when she saw me and grew to the size of a giant, even bigger than the Talls. Uncle created fires out of thin air, and they trapped people. He said the crawler below had inspired the Talls to make him brand new. Papa and I ran, but I think we were the only ones who escaped. Papa is hurt, Garl, and I am alone. You have to help. End quote. During an escape, a gnome actually stole one of the nether scrolls where he learned incredible illusion spells. Spells which he shared amongst the other gnomish people. It is believed that the reason why gnomes in the Forgotten Realms have such a natural facility with illusion magic is because they casted upon themselves permanent spells from one of these stolen scrolls. Now, the Netherese ended up fighting a mysterious group of monsters called the Phaerimm from the Underdark, which effectively countered the magic of the Netherese since they had power that allowed them to absorb magic and also drain it from their surroundings. It was the Phaerimm that started the process of consuming the land and destroying it, turning it into the desert that you see today. This magic absorbing power was destroying the enclaves of the Netherese left and right, and had already devastated the cities of the Netherese that were on the land. Here is a little timeline guide so that you can see how everything just sort of evolved over time and where we are in the years. But yeah, Iolaum, who was still alive at this time thanks to this spell which he created that extended his lifespan, he was basically the leader, the de facto leader of the Netherese, and he could not figure out a way to stop the Phaerimm, and so he abandoned the Netherese, which caused a major panic amongst the populace. By then, an arch-wizard named Karsus had sort of then grown to become the new de facto leader of the Netherese, really just an extremely powerful arcanist, and in order to quell the fears of his people, he did the unthinkable. He attempted to end the war in one swift stroke by creating and casting the only ever made and only ever casted 12-level spell. He was most likely trying to imitate what the elves had done prior in order to finish off the dragons. Now, this spell was called Karsus Avatar, and the idea was that he was going to basically take on the form of a god so that he could use the weave in order to instantly slay all of the Phaerimm. However, the tax on the weave was just too great, and magic started to dismantle to the point where, if nothing was done, all of the weave on the planet would be destroyed everywhere. So Mistral, who at the time was the goddess of magic, she was essentially forced to sacrifice herself in order to turn off the weave and restart it before it was too late. The momentary severing of the weave caused Karsus, who at the time was engorged in divine power, to become petrified and instantly just die. It also caused all of the Mythalars in every single Netherese enclave to shut down, which caused all of the cities who were levitating thanks to the Mythalars to fall down onto the earth and crash. Almost overnight, the empire of the Netherese collapsed as all of the floating cities were destroyed, save for just a few that were spared, and many of the cities on the ground were also destroyed further by the magic of the Phaerimm, who basically just started to take over the land, now that the kingdom of the Netherese was basically no more. Then, shortly after, a new goddess of magic was raised, who now called herself Mystra, who would be a lot more stringent with the rules for magic. Of course, based on everything that had transpired prior. The previous goddess of magic was more neutral. She kind of just allowed things to happen. But that time would end with this new Mystra. She was a lot more strict. In particular, this Mystra would now prevent the casting of any spell of 10th level or higher, saying that those spells would weaken and damage the weave too much to be allowed. Many of the Netherese would then leave their ancestral lands as they would inevitably be consumed by the desert thanks to the magic of the Phaerimm. Some of the Netherese would move on to the Dells in Cormanthyr, some would migrate through the dwarvish Delzone Empire and onto the west, and specifically to parts of the Sword Coast north. Others would escape in flying ships and settle in this region right here, eventually forming the small kingdom known as Halrua. And others would use their magic to simply plane shift away from the planet altogether, some even teleporting their entire enclave onto the Shadow Realm. Now, throughout the years of the Netherese Empire while they were still going, the scrolls would be taken and stolen by various different parties. Some were stolen by elves, others, like we talked about, by gnomes, others by unknown figures, to the point where the vast majority of the scrolls currently are in unknown locations and controlled by unknown individuals. Some, for example, were hidden under the grandfather tree in the high forest. Others given to Mistra for safekeeping. I believe you can actually find one nether scroll in one of the adventures in Candlekeep Mysteries hidden away. You should check it out if you're interested. But anyways, Yulaum would end up building himself a lair in the Underdark and take on many pupils in secret, including a large host of mind flayers who would later be called the Alhun, who would be henceforth be the name given to all of the mind flayer liches. Yulaum would then perform a ritual to literally create a new Elder Brain. However, an undead lich-like Elder Brain, basically constructing it from the essence of many of his Mind Flayer pupils. Then he would use unknown magic in order to fuse his essence with this newly created lich-like Elder Brain, becoming the Elder Brain himself. And so, believe it or not, Yulaum exists to this day, only known as the Oracle of Elintal, as one of the most powerful creatures in the Forgotten Realms, in the form of a lich Elder Brain. Now, with the destruction of the Netherese, the Phaerimm would eventually move over to attack the Delzone Empire in what is now the area around the Silver Marches, completely destroying that Dwarvish empire with only the fortresses and a token number of dwarves in them still standing. The Phaerimm, however, would be defeated by the Sharns. So, in our second video on this series, where we covered the Crown Wars, you might remember that the city of Meritar was destroyed in this high magic-infused cataclysm. And now, I described it that a few powerful high mages of the Meritar kingdom went in an attempt to neutralize it, but failed. So the High Moor is effectively what was left of this Meritar kingdom after this high magic completely destroyed it. Well, those Dark Elf high mages that went in attempted a high magic spell of their own that didn't quite work as they had intended, which instead transformed them into the Sharn, a weird collection of sentient goo-like creatures that melted with the land and entered a deep sleep for millennia. Now, these Sharn creatures had been imbued with a special distaste for life-draining magic, especially those that fed on the land, such as the one that was used on Meritar. And so they were awakened and spurred into action by the now expanding threat of the Phaerimm, who were draining all life wherever they went. The fight between these two lasted around 600 years, and it would end up with the defeat of the Phaerimm, who would all be captured in what is now known as the Sharn Wall, basically a shimmering silver-colored magical barrier. The defeat of the Phaerimm halted the spread of the Anauroch, which was just expanding and expanding as the Phaerimm was just consuming everything. And so as they were defeated, it stayed basically just how you see it here. One of the biggest magical scars and remembrances of the ancient wars that last up until this day. It's actually very interesting that basically every single desert that exists in the Forgotten Realms actually comes from magic consuming the earth. None of the deserts that you see here on this map came by naturally, it seems. But anyways, here is once again a timeline of the events that have transpired so that you can easily see the passage of time and where everything fits within the timeline. Because the Netherese Empire was so vast, and many of the cities flied and moved across their domain, the search for the destroyed cities has been a source of inspiration for many adventurers who seek to plunder those magical ruins. The desert itself is filled with wonders and sunken cities filled with riches, but leftovers of the main cities can also be found even as far as the Sword Coast to this day, and even in places as far north as Icewind Dale. Again, because the cities were flying all over the place, you can find those destroyed cities almost anywhere. Now, not many pure-blood Netherese remain nowadays, as most, as you would understand, intermingled during their escape of the collapse of the Empire. But those that do exist, the pure-blood Netherese, are generally isolated, which has led them to maintain their descendancy untouched. You have a few tribes in the marches west of what is nowadays Cormanthyr. You have barbarians from the Tonlands, certain nomadic barbarians from the Ride, and of course, the one group of Netherese that managed to escape the fall of the Empire by shifting onto the realm of shadow, though they would not reappear in Phaerimm for another 1700 years. The mysterious lich-like creature that they called the Terraseer would never again be seen in the story of the Forgotten Realms. He had guided the Netherese through their ascension, he had translated the powerful Nether Scrolls for them, and even warned them of their hubris. His last appearance would be right before Karsus would cast his magnum opus, his 12-level spell, as he would show only to warn the Netherese of what Karsus was about to do. He told the Netherese that Karsus was about to change magic forever, and of course, he did, though not at all to the benefit of the Netherese. And we would never again see this Terraseer. At the beginning of time, when the world was still encased in ice, there was a reason why it was in ice in the first place. The world prior had been a battle zone for gods and primordials, and in this battle of mythical proportions, legends say that a powerful serpent-like primordial devoured the sun and ushered an age of darkness and coldness that enveloped the world. Whether it was true or not is far beyond mortals to ever discover, and of course gods are silent about such matters, but what is true is that this primordial was betrayed by another primordial, one who tricked it and got it imprisoned in a magically sealed gate far up in a volcano in the lands of Chult, right here. In recompense for betraying its ally, the gods granted this primordial dominion over this land, provided of course that he protected it and safeguarded the prison of this snake-like monstrous being. The betrayer is called Ubtao, or Ubtao the Betrayer as he has been called, and the snake? Dendar the Night Serpent, or perhaps the World Serpent, the very same one that blessed the original Serox at the beginning of time. Now, it is hard to tell whether this Dendar the Night Serpent is the very same snake entity that blessed the Serox, because snakes are known to shed their skin over time and take on multiple personalities, which is ironically what ended up destroying the reign of the Serox in the first place. But I digress. The land of Chult layered empty for millennia save for the minions of Ubtao, who we named the Coatls, who fight day and night against the minions of the Serpent, the UNT, that dominate the forgotten and dilapidated old capitals of the Serox to the east of the peninsula. With the battles weakening the Coatls, Ubtao searched for more who would answer his call, and so he sent many of his helpers out onto the continents far beyond, specifically the unknown lands to the west, which frankly, we don't really know anything about. We haven't really been told much about these lands in the lore. The year is minus 2890 R. The Coatl messengers spread out the message of Ubtao onto these forgotten lands and found the Tabaxi, the Eshowi, and the Tingith human tribes. Now, you need to understand that these are not like actual Tabaxis, as in, these are not the leopard humanoid creatures that you might be familiar with. These are just normal, but relatively primitive humans. See, when these humans eventually made their way onto Phaerimm, they happened to be wearing tiger and leopard-like hide skin. And so when the human races of Phaerimm got to know them and called them Tabaxi as that was their name, they also ended up calling the actual animal creature Tabaxis because of the humans. So in reality, it is these guys who are actually misnamed. A little confusing, but yeah. Anyways, these human tribes had their own beliefs and followed their own god, though it would be probably more apt to say that they were intimidated by their own god, who presumably abused them. Again, not much is known about this god that they revered, but we know that its name was Ulorobo. Now, this god had demigod-like children that these tribes used to interact with, one of which was a Tarask, who they called a child of Ulorobo. The story says that this Tarask was actually intelligent and actually spearheaded a massive war against the Serox of Mershulk tens of thousands of years ago. So all of the Tabaxi, and presumably even multiple Tarasks, fought the Serox of Mershulk and actually won. Again, keep in mind that the Serox at this point in time basically dominated almost the entire planet. So winning against the most powerful empire that has presumably ever existed was huge. Though something happened to this demigod main Tarask, which turned it angry and hateful. In its hatred, it ended up devouring a bunch of the other demigods and then set out to sleep, only to awake every 1,000 years. The Tabaxi would basically be destroyed almost every time by the awakening Tarask, and it became something of a religion to them, something that would happen every 1,000 years, until Ubtao blessed a Tabaxi known as Uyai with chosen power. See, a chosen is basically a mortal that has been blessed with divine power, usually in order for that mortal to perform tasks designated by that god. So imagine something of a mortal right hand for a god. Well, with one punch, Uyai destroyed the Tarask. Then, when all of the Tabaxi and the other tribes saw the power of Ubtao, they ended up following the Coatls on 300 canoes over to Chult, where they would end up becoming the protectors and guardians of both the land and also the seals that would chain Dendar onto that big volcano. Ubtao then built for them the holy city of Mesro, and then created more chosen in order to become demigod rulers of that city. Eventually, Ubtao would end up abandoning the city, claiming that he grew tired of the petty squabbles and all that they would ask of him, and so he would separate himself into multiple animal essences that would then roam Chult independently of each other as spirit animals. But then a massive civil war would end up destroying the city as the Tabaxi and the Eshui would fight one another in the year minus 137 DR. In order to save the city, one of the chosen called Rasnasi summoned a bunch of undead, which did help save the city, but resulted in his banishment for the taboo of using the dead. Even to this day, all of those undead that he created on this great war still roam the jungles of Chult to this day. So the jungles are just chock full of undead, including dinosaur undeads and many other types of creatures. This civil war severely weakened the humans of the region, allowing then for the overpopulation of the Bachiri goblins that also lived in the region, creating one of the most goblin-populated locations actually in the world, again, even today. However, throughout the years before the weakening, the power of Mesro and the further migration of more humans moving south from Calimshan would end up weakening the UNT on the east, at least enough to push them onto this very small section of land. But yeah, all of those human races that came from this unknown continent to the west ended up forming the culture and races that we now recognize as Chultan that live on this continent. Now, moving on onto the open world, this particular age is when elves and dwarves really do end up basically almost disappearing, and of course, the humans dominating. As we start this age, we have the greatest empire of the dwarves called Shanatar, basically in shambles. Most of their populace has migrated outwards to form other kingdoms, and the upper section of Shanatar, which was located right here north of Calimshan, at this point has been completely taken by Calimshan. They basically had a war with Calimshan, and Calimshan ended up winning. Now, out of these kingdoms that sprouted out from Shanatar, Ogram has basically collapsed thanks to disease and monsters such as bugbears and lizardfolk. Hong Danar collapsed onto itself as it was a coastal city that was founded right here, and it is said that the dwarves grew mad from the ocean. They are creatures of stone after all, and so the ocean did not sit them well at all, and so they ended up getting overtaken by giants and trolls over time. Garagaur was another kingdom that was completely destroyed by orcs. Besselmer right here was constructed and destroyed merely a few thousand years later by humanoids and giants. And these are just like the mini kingdoms that sprawled out of Shanatar that are already destroyed before we even start this age. More, of course, would go down as the age of humanity would start unfolding, including the very center of Shanatar underground. See, Deep Shanatar, as it was called, under the area that we know as Calimshan, would be absolutely obliterated by no one else but the Duergar during the year minus 1800 DR. See, the Duergar had been unstoppable until now. They founded their big city of Gracklstug in minus 3717 DR, called the City of Blades. And only 400 years later, they formed the mini-empire called the Deep Kingdom, with, of course, Gracklstug as its centerpiece. 50 years before the fall of Shanatar, the Duergar started this massive crusade of expansion and war, leadered by their queen Duergar, and they just ended up basically dominating most of the middle and upper Underdark. They made attacks against the Mindflayers of Orindol, the Drow, and they allegedly even destroyed an entire kingdom of Quaggots, eventually culminating in the utter defeat of the dwarves of Shanatar in a victory so one-sided that the Queen Duergar literally was blessed with an apotheosis. She was made into a goddess of the Duergar. And this would be the time when you would say that the Duergar were at their apex. But of course, from an apex, one can only really go down from there. I mean, that's the nature of what an apex literally means. So from then on, they would suffer a slow decline afterwards from this moment onto the present day, as they would basically just slowly hold on to their lands and become more and more isolated, not really expanding and not really accomplishing anything great after that. And of course, as we know, because the Duergar get no feeling of joy or pride in the things that they do, all that they had left now was just that burning hatred of the Shanatar dwarves for leaving them in the hands of the Mindflayers. And so, now with the dwarves defeated, the Duergar would just enter this millennia-long somnolescence, where they would just stagnate up until today. Now, as far as leftover dwarvish realms are concerned, we have the massive Delzone Empire, which is still really strong up in the north, and then we have Amarindar, which is considerably smaller but holds great influence in the area. The Delzone would build incredible fortresses, some of which took decades and decades of construction with thousands of dwarves working day and night. They also built tremendous roads underground which they would use to trade with the humans of Netheril. Trade that would make them very, very rich, as Netheril was incredibly wealthy, as you know. Eventually though, the same thing that took out the Netherese would also take out the Delzone, which were the Phaerimm. When Karsus called his 12th level spell and destroyed all of the floating cities, the Phaerimm continued their onslaught onto the west, entering dwarf lands and also, of course, destroying them, especially so since they had been weakened by constant and just like never-ending orc attacks from the north. However, even though the Delzone Empire collapsed, the beautiful fortresses were left standing, so you can still see them up to this day. They're still controlled by dwarf clans. You can still go there, even though the dwarves in this area tend to be very isolationist. They're quite gorgeous to see. Now, the Amarindar kingdom would defend itself tremendously against orc onslaughts for many, many generations, but would eventually fall to the orcs much later on at around the year 882, making it the longest lasting shield dwarf kingdom. And so, as it stands now, by the end of the Age of Humanity, no shield dwarf kingdom would remain fully standing, except of course by those lone fortresses with most of the shield dwarf population scattered around now human cities or collected just generally around the Silver Marches. Gold dwarves, on the other hand, would continue to thrive in the Great Rift, the place where it is believed that dwarves originally sprouted from at the beginning of time. If you remember, the place was overtaken by the Dark Elves right after their descent as Drow, but the caves all collapsed, killing most of those Drow, allowing the dwarves to reclaim it. And so, from that moment, which at the time was minus 7,600 DR, those gold dwarves have been controlling the area basically up until this day. In fact, the Great Rift is the largest concentration of dwarves in the world, and really is the only real kingdom of dwarves that is left. Of course, over time, they would fight both Unther and Yamdath here and there, but they would be effective in safeguarding all of their lands. Now, this is something that I should have mentioned during the founding time, but it escaped me, and now for the sake of completeness, I should probably put it here. There are two main groups of halflings in the world. There are those that were brought here as slaves by the Jinn Calim, who now live on these areas over here, and of course, eventually would migrate upwards onto the Sword Coast. These halflings were brought in at around minus 7,800 DR, but then there are the other halflings, the ones that were natural to this world, which is really a bit unknown exactly when they ended up appearing, but they were basically seen by humans in Lurin as early as minus 6,000 DR. And by then, they had already built all of their towns and cities at around here in this part of the map. These halflings would make this little corner of the world their home, and eventually would grow into their own kingdom, which, by the way, still exists to this day. So if you're wondering what would be the capital of the dwarves and the halflings nowadays, well, here would be the dwarves and here would be the halflings. It's just that because most of Dungeons & Dragons has focused primarily on the Sword Coast, which is this area, we just don't get to explore some of the other great stuff that exists in the world. We're used to dwarves only having, old ancient fortresses and no big cities of their own. We're used to elves and halflings living in human cities with no home of their own either. But there is a giant dwarvish kingdom, and there is a massive halfling kingdom as well. It's just really interesting that we just don't get the time or the adventures really to explore them. And of course, as we mentioned on our video on Netheril, the gnomes would have a sort of capital as well, which would be right here. Its name is Songfarla. It's a city completely hidden by illusions. Now, there's also technically another one, which is right over here called Lantan, but that wouldn't really start coming together until the present day. And the cities there boast both gnomes and humans, so it's not really like a gnome city as much as it really is a human city that has a lot of gnomes, if that makes any sense. So if you want like a big city that is literally just only gnomes, then Songfarla would be where you would go, though again, very important to note that gnomes are just very, very rare in this world. And even in their biggest city, they're quite small, with only a population of about 12,000 gnomes in there. Now, let's talk about some human kingdoms, because of course, this era gets its name from those. Now, Calimshan is really the most important one here, other than Netheril, of course, though the story of Calimshan is very, very complicated, and most of it is, quite frankly, not really that important to the world at large. By the beginning of this era, Calimshan becomes a strong empire as they destroy Upper Shanatar. But then, non-stop disaster after disaster falls onto that kingdom. I'm gonna start naming them here, showing you the dates so that you can see just how wild of a history this guy's had. They destroy Upper Shanatar. Then a massive city of beholders is discovered on the Alimir Mountains, who then rapidly invade the city. The beholders end up destroying the eastern fortifications until eventually they are pushed back onto the mountains. Through a series of guild wars, most of the city in Calimshan is then destroyed and then further rebuilt in the religious style that is now most commonly known as of today. Calimshan battles a great kingdom of hobgoblins in 4 great battles, and of course, destroys them utterly. Calimshan becomes huge, encompassing as far north as the Snowflake Mountains, which basically means they take over what is now known today as Calimshan, Mir, Tethir, and Itzikar. Quote, in retribution for Kalashite adventurers plundering her hoard and slaying one of her brood, Ilvirasalisar, the Rose Dragon, destroys Calimshan's army, the Caliph's court, the Rayor Bakal, and 2/3 of Kalimport before she settles onto the Bakal's throne and rules the heart of the empire. Much of Kalimport Muzad, the subterranean portion of the city, comes into being as a result of the Red Dragon's attack, as her demands for the city's immediate reconstruction forces builders to simply smooth out the rubble and begin again on top of the old structures. End quote. Dragon Slayers eventually do wound the dragon almost a bit about 100 years later, and an ally Bronze Dragon helps to finish up the job, allowing humans to rule the kingdom once again, though not after bloody fights over the throne. Another 300 years after that, a powerful beholder from the Alimir Mountains called Kiraptir the Blood Eye organizes multiple beholders on a great daring attack on Calimshan, which succeeds. The leader, which is now called the Pasha, dies in the attack, and now Kiraptir sits on the throne as beholders rampage through the countryside. Calimshan is utterly destroyed. Then, almost 30 years later, a religious rebellion is formed, and the priests manage to oust Kiraptir from the throne and fight the beholders out of the cities. The beholder lord successfully escapes then onto the mountains. 120 years later, a massive war begins with the Kingdom of Calimshan and the Beholder Nations, with Kiraptir being the overlord of those Beholder Nations. The war lasts for 200 years before eventually Calimshan emerges victorious. Quote, the Pasha's throne at Kalimport now rules from the Sword Coast to Mintar. The increased trade and influence sees Kalimport nearly double in size, to nearly the size of present-day Waterdeep, end quote. 100 years later, a massive intermittent plague hits Calimport. The first plague, which alone kills nearly half of Calimport's slaves and forces the Pasha and nobility to hide in their homes for over 2 years. Then, 200 years later, the Night Wars begin, one of the bloodiest wars in the history of Faerûn between Calimshan and the Drow, though it also includes many invasions of the Drow onto other lands. Then, 100 years later, a big Drow attack at night destroys the palace with the entire ruling family within it. The war general controls the city through force as the Drow control sections of the city. Sections of the empire start to become more independent as this is happening, as the populace seeks to leave the kingdom in fears of these night raids. Then, 27 years later, quote, the Drow nearly destroy the town of Keltar in Calimshan over the course of a 37-hour battle, given their magical superiority and a glow of darkness that they used to surround the city. Calimport's army arrives after the Drow conquer the city and have shipped more than half of the surviving population into the Underdark as slaves. Although the Kalashites free the town and force the Drow back into the Underdark, more than 3,000 Keltams are never seen again. End quote. Then, 15 years later, quote, large parts of Calimport are purposefully destroyed to bury the Drow temples and partially subterranean villages. But some remain relatively intact, though buried. Those same wizards who burned the city help rebuild it and seal off all areas between Calimport and the Underdark with stone and new buildings. Despite their diligence, the Drow reopened those passages within a decade and re-established their hold on Calimport below, now nicely protected by the city overhead. End quote. And then finally, 130 years later, the war ends between the Drow and the Calimshan as the Calimshan Pasha strikes a secret deal with the matron mothers of the Drow. At the end of the Night Wars, it is estimated that over 75,000 humans were taken by the Drow and enslaved, while over 150,000 humans would die fighting that war, though it is also estimated that the Drow would suffer a similar number of dead. I told you, this history is insane, and we're not even done. 100 years later, a massive fire destroys the entire harbor of Calimport, which single-handedly obliterates the entire armada of the kingdom, and because the winds push the fire onto the city, Calimport loses over 70% of its buildings. These are numbers that are given to us. 70% of the buildings in Calimport were lost. Then 80 years later, another plague hits Calimport, though this one is even worse than the last one. The Pasha orders the city to be burned in order to destroy the plague, but the fires refuse to burn the city as before, and so literally everyone just abandons the plague city. Priests of Talona, who is the god of poisons, conquers the empty city in order to steal its riches. The only people that live within the city at this point would be escaped slaves, rogues, and necromancers. During this time, the city was actually called the Rogue City. The plague ends about 5 years later, and as it does, the Pasha, quote, re-enters Calimport and initiates a bloodbath that destroys all those who remain in the city as traitors or plague carriers. Many folk, including the clergy of Talona that ruled the city, survive by fleeing into the Undercity, end quote. 80 years later, Tethir becomes independent from the Calimshan Empire. Then 50 years later, quote, Calimshan retakes Calimran and Miradma. Able workers, more than a third of the population of both of these towns, are enslaved and brought to Calimport to work on the new Pasha's palace. The 1,480 warriors among the 5,500 new slaves are all sentenced to the New Gen Arena, where many of them fight to the death against monsters and each other for the amusement of the masses, end quote. Then lastly, 3 years later, quote, Calimport increases in population and area to its largest size ever, its true citizens numbering more than 75,000. For the next 8 centuries, Calimport remains the largest and most frequented port on Faerûn's shores. End quote. I am not even done, but I have to go faster because there's just so much going on. I just can't keep doing it like this. So Kalimport is burned again, the Beholder nations resurge again, and more war happens in the kingdom. Tethyr is colonized again in a brutal war. 5 massive tidal waves destroy from 1 to 2/3 of every single port city in that kingdom. The death of an important pasha creates a massive destabilizing wave that creates over 30 new families vying for power, all of which kill each other trying to get to the throne, and all of the cities basically burn again. And eventually, years later, a massive slave revolt causes the empire to sort of collapse at around the year 500 DR, which, by the way, also causes all of Kalimport to burn, and the city is destroyed again. In any case, at this point, Tethyr obtains his independence, and at this point for the last time, and a new kingdom is formed in the middle between Tethyr and Calimshan called Amn, which becomes a powerful merchant nation. So here is a bit of a summary of Calimshan's timeline compared to some of the other topics that we have talked about on our previous videos, so that you can see how that timeline relates to these ones. Now, if you want to ask me how these guys remained so powerful and so relevant after all of these issues, I have no clue. But one thing is for certain, Calimshan might have conquered the world if it wasn't for all of these calamities. My god. But now, let's move over a bit to the east to the kingdom of Yamdath. If you guys remember, it was these guys who basically curtailed Calimshan's ambitions to expand onto the east. They were a powerful Psionic kingdom who expanded quite far, or at least they would have wanted to expand even farther, but it was also Calimshan who blocked their western border, and an entirely new threat was now forming in their east. See, with the fall of the Imaskar Empire, when the Mesopotamian and Egyptian gods finally found their way onto this world and fomented a massive slave rebellion that toppled the empire, the now demigods took their people and formed their own separate kingdoms, with Mulhorand controlled by the Egyptian demigods and Unther controlled by the Mesopotamian demigods. The land where Imaskari existed prior had been completely obliterated by the power of the demigods, and now was nothing more than just like a magically induced desert. So a massive immigration westward was warranted, especially since there was still Imaskari-controlled lands to the east, though it was also blocked off by mountains. Now, those lost Imaskari cities onto the east that never got destroyed in the war would later on become the first roots of the Asian-inspired continent of Kara-Tur. But anyhow, both Mulhorand and Unther would become extremely powerful, as the God Kings would bring unparalleled prosperity and power to both kingdoms for millennia. They would fight amongst each other a bit at the beginning, but eventually would set a border between the two that both of them would be happy with and ally against their enemies from now on. Unther in particular would fight and absorb a massive section of Yamdath on its western border, though 500 years later, Yamdath would be able to restore those original borders. Unther would also eventually fight with the dwarves of the Great Rift to the south, but nothing would really come out of that encounter. Now, Mulhorand would actually invent ship technology as it would be known today. So the ships that you see nowadays whenever you play D&D, those were invented by Mulhorand at around the year minus 1500 DR. And those would allow dominion over the seas and further expansion for Mulhorand. Now, both Unther and Mulhorand would inevitably start conquering many of the lands to the north, albeit very slowly. The Star Elves from the Yuurwood, which we talked about on our Half-Elf video, would fight with the humans a bit, but ultimately decide to abandon these lands instead, realizing that there's really no point in stopping the humans because they just reproduce way too fast and there's just too many. So the Star Elves open up portals and abandon Phaerimm like completely in exchange for a demiplane that runs concordant with the Yuurwood, where they still live in there up until this day. The remaining elves of the forest intermingled with expanding humans, inevitably forming the half-elves that exist in nowadays Aglarand and the Yuurwood. And in fact, the Yuurwood is the largest concentration of half-elves in the world, and would end up becoming the racial capital, as it would be considered by many today. Anyhow, both Mulhorand and Unther would suffer a catastrophic war thanks to a wizard called Thade, who was known as one of the last apprentices to the powerful wizards of ancient Imaskari. He basically had knowledge of the rare technology of the Imaskari, in particular the portals that the Imaskari used in order to move across the empire, and also the portals that they used to enslave the Egyptian and Mesopotamian people from Earth. Technology that originally the Imaskari had taken from the original Batrachi back in the olden days, one of the creator races. Now, Thaid was attempting to create civil strife in order to break down both kingdoms of Mulhorand and Unther, and he did so by constructing a massive portal, much like the ones that the Imaskari used to get to Earth, except that this one connected onto a world that was completely dominated by religious orc zealots. Thaid was eventually killed, and with him the knowledge of the portal, which laid there basically unmolested, untouched for almost 5 years, just unseen and unfound. And through that time, those 5 years, hordes and hordes of orcs stormed through those magical gates and onto Phaerimm. Now, let's take a step back. Now we have two different kinds of orcs that may or may not come from the same planet. See, the original orcs that appeared tens of thousands of years ago, which were likely summoned forth through portals by the Batrachi, were summoned up in the mountains on the western, particularly north side of Phaerimm. These orcs are dumb, they are monstrous, and they're meant to look really like pigs. They would be the archetypal sort of like pig-like orc. They destroy everything in their path, they forcefully reproduce with other races against their will, and overall are just irredeemably evil. The half-orcs that you find on the western side of Phaerimm basically all come from the evil conquering and reproduction that comes from these orcs. Most of the orcs that you find in Dungeons & Dragons are technically meant to be these kinds of orcs. They are very powerful and have many holdings scattered up in the mountains, especially in the spine of the world where they come down every few hundred years in massive hordes to conquer and destroy. These orcs are generally called mountain orcs. Now, these new orcs that are just entering the world as of the year minus 1076 DR are called Grey Orcs. They are the ones that are portrayed in both the Monster Manual and in Volo's Guide to Monsters for 5th edition. They are a bit more civilized, they're a bit more intelligent, though, still below average, so below human intelligence, but they are more than anything highly religious, with very complex rituals and a whole deific pantheon. Well, the hordes of Grey Orcs came forth from the Great Portal in what today would be called Thay, though back then it was still controlled by Unther and Mulhorand, and so began the Orcgate Wars. The orcs, as orcs do, completely destroyed everything and amassed enormous victories early on in the war. One of their greatest strengths was their divine magic, as they had highly accomplished clerics. I mean, like, really, their whole race was zealot in their veneration of Grumsh and its orcish pantheon. So much so, in fact, that in great rituals, they actually summoned powerful avatars of their orcish gods. Now, these avatars fought the god kings, the avatars of both the Egyptian and Mesopotamian gods, and it was a complete slaughter. We actually call this the Battle of the Gods. This battle happened in minus 1071 DR, so basically 5 years into the war. Re, the avatar of Ra and leader of the god kings of Mulhorand, perished in a fight against Grumsh, chief god of the orcs. As he died, he spread his power over to Horus, who would evolve into Horus Re, and would also spread his essence onto his army's weapons, who would then become orc-slaying weapons. Mulhorand's god kings, however, suffered the most, as Irana was killed by Bactru, Giru was killed by Luthik, Nurgle was killed by Ilnaval, Nana Sin was killed by Shargus, and Ki alongside Utu were killed as well by undisclosed orcish deities. Then, this might sound like a bit of a plot twist, but Tiamat showed up. See, veneration of Tiamat was brought up again in great numbers in Phaerimm thanks to the original Mesopotamian humans. Tiamat is a goddess of chaos and primordial creation in Mesopotamian religion, and so churches to Tiamat would inevitably spring forth in Unther throughout this time. This veneration must have brought Tiamat's attention back to Faerûn after so many millennia, because it is also noted that during this time in particular, the chromatics and metallic dragons fought a lot against each other. Marduk, a god king of Unther, represented an earth version of Bahamut, and so both of them would fight on and off throughout this time as well. In any case, during the Battle of the Gods, as Gilgium, one of the god kings of Unther, was fighting Ilnaval, an orcish god, Tiamat prepared a surprise attack to kill Gilgium, but it was intercepted by Marduk, who ended up sacrificing himself in order to kill Tiamat. All in all, just like an insane climactic war that turned the tide against the orcs. In particular, thanks to the now orc-slaying blast that the soldiers had in their weapons, thanks to the sacrifice of Ra. Many Grey Orcs would be pushed back onto the portal, while many others would be slaughtered during the war. Some clans and groups of Grey Orcs did escape in the end, scattering across the eastern north side of Faerûn in attempts to survive against the God Kings. And so nowadays, the Grey Orcs live either in very remote locations, far from civilization, or as nomads who travel from place to place. These Grey Orcs would never really amount to much else, however, as the tribes that would survive would be no more than, say, 50 orcs per tribe, and being forced to live nomadic lives would never allow them to reproduce with the same fervor as their mountain cousins. Now, a huge factor that allowed for the defeat of the orcs were the large number of mercenaries that were hired from across the north. When the Orcgate Wars ended and those mercenaries returned home, they would actually start making towns and cities which would form small kingdoms over time, and those kingdoms would inevitably grow into Narfell and Raumathar. These two have their own insane history. Narfell, which started as a collection of small kingdoms, would be all dominated by a powerful sorcerer who would unite them all into the kingdom of Narfell. Then he would attempt to invade Mulhorand and fail, only to then be invaded itself by the armies of Raumathar. The war between Narfell and Raumathar would be bloody and would last for around 500 years. The sorcerer that controlled Narfell at the time was a fervent follower of Orcus, and so he instilled upon his kingdom the veneration of demons, and through many demonic pacts, the people of Narfell would develop powerful sorcerer's powers themselves, as well as the ability to summon demons for the war. Raumathar, on the other hand, possessed knowledge taken from Imaskar, who they used in order to build portals and powerful golems. The battles would go back and forth as their kingdoms would be completely destroyed by the war, with each side becoming more and more desperate and resorting into more and more terrible actions. Narfell, for example, would summon the demon lord Kochchi alongside legions of frost giants. Raumathar would elicit the aid of white dragons, as well as their superior magic, in order to not just counter, but push the fight deep into Narfell territory, forcing then Narfell to become more desperate and summon a demon lord called Eltab, who then brought with him countless legions of demons, which obliterated the armies of Raumathar. However, as demon lords do, Eltab decided that it was actually in his best interest to just do whatever the hell he wanted, and started then conquering lands for itself, as demons would spread out and fairly destroyed everything that they saw everywhere. Raumathar, in order to save their kingdom and destroy the demons, summoned an avatar of the elemental lord Kosuth, in an event that would then be known as the Great Conflagration. Kosuth would burn everything indiscriminately, destroying both armies and destroying both realms. In the end, both kingdoms basically lost everything. Raumathar would become the Endless Waste, as it is known today, with the entire kingdom basically just burned to ash. Many would escape to the east, with others that would congregate around this lake here in this small region that we called Rashomon. A group of powerful women called the Witches of Rashomon would then bring back order and maintain some of that lore that Raumathar had lost. They would imprison the demon lord Eltab and then help destroy the demons, at least in this very contained small area. Now, Narfell would retain nothing but its name, as demons would spread out across the region and basically pillage all they saw. The peoples of Narfell would devolve into barbarism, many eventually moving on to Damara and Vasa, which would be new regions that would open up centuries later once the ice caps here would melt. This land would be particularly notorious for producing tieflings, as many humans from Narfell would continuously reproduce or make deals with demons, whether throughout the Great War or after. Then at around this time, back down here, Yamdath would suffer from a tyrannical ruler that would oust the democracy of the kingdom and would take complete power. He would start attempting to conquer lands by ships, which would start fairly well, until the kingdom found itself in need of large quantities of wood. And so Yamdath would start taking wood from the elf forest of Nikerimath, slaughtering all the elves that opposed them. Enraged by this, the elves of the forest casted a powerful high magic spell that then sent massive waves of water from the Sea of Fallen Stars right onto the kingdom of Yamdath, effectively destroying most of its cities in one fell swoop, which of course precipitated the fall of that kingdom. The high magic spell was actually so powerful that this created a permanent enlargement of the Sea of Moving Stars, completely inundating most of the area in what is now known as the Billahan Reach. So this place right here, it used to not have water before this calamity. Then, at the very end of the Age of Humanity, a group of followers who believed in the same mantra as Thade, the wizard who opened up the Orcgate originally and wanted secession from the God Kings, called themselves the Red Wizards, as an homage to Thade, who used the red robes as a symbol of the original rebellion. These wizards, however, actually succeeded in the rebellion where Thade had originally failed. They ended up sacking the provincial capital of the region and even freed the demon lord Eltab to aid them, which he did. See, Eltab at the time had escaped imprisonment from the witches of Rashmed. He had gone berserk and done a few terrible things before he was again imprisoned right where Thaymount would be located, really right under it actually. But with the help of the Demon Lord, the Mulhorand armies were routed, which allowed for this region right here to then secede from Mulhorand, calling themselves Thay. They then imprisoned Eltab once again underground and then built their new capital city on top of his prison. Now, to end this video, let's talk about the elves as they appeared during the Age of Humanity. The elves of Nikerimath had a thriving realm, but then of course Yamdath started slaughtering them for their wood. It is actually said that 9 out of 10 elves were killed, and only one elvish city on that kingdom was left. Rusian Shan, which is the name of the city, lays hidden to this day with powerful magic. It was this culling of their people that forced the elves to seek retribution in the form of a high magic spell that, as we know, ended the kingdom of Yamdath. A spell which killed approximately 60,000 humans, which again, these numbers are just insane. However, the green elf kingdom of Nikerimath was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed after that calamity. Now, the Star Elves from the Yurewood, as we also covered, ended up abandoning Phaerimm in favor of a demiplane as the encroachment of humans threatened their way of life. Many Green Elves, after the terrible battles of the Crown War, seek to isolate themselves in the deepest forest of Phaerimm, frankly detaching themselves from Elvish culture, Elvish gods, and instead just living a peaceful, primitive life away from progress and away from magic. These Green Elves would eventually morph into the Wild Elves that we know today, who may still be found in many forgotten forests of the world, though to you guys they would basically seem as just barbarian elves. Notably, you can find them around these areas in the Candlewood, Forest of Amtar, Chult, and Chizenta. Now, if you guys remember, the Elvish kingdom of Keltormir was completely destroyed by red dragons before it was taken by the genie Calim, before that Calim was disposed by humans and dwarves. Then we have the Elvish kingdom of Illafarm, which was the only other main survivor of the Crown Wars, outside of Keltormir of course, who ended up thriving at least until about minus 1110 DR. Even though they had held strong against the orcs of the Spine of the World, they saw that humans were quickly expanding into their territories and, much like the Star Elves, instead of fighting them, they simply decided to abandon their kingdoms in peace and then retreat onto Evermeet. They used powerful high magic to literally delete their cities so that no trace of them would be left, other than perhaps some leftover high magic that is very, very difficult to clear away. Humans would inevitably settle in that region where the capital was located, and the city of Waterdeep would be founded in there. And in fact, some of that residual high magic that the capital city of Illifarm used to have can still be felt to this day in Waterdeep. Now, some small groups of elves from the Illifarm Empire would stay, but in small sections of forest scattered across the north. Then we have the Elvish Kingdom of Ristalwood that would struggle for the entirety of this era, basically, as the Drow would be relentless in their pursuit of dominating parts of the world above ground. We talked about their terrible assaults on Calimshan, but their efforts were also spent attacking many of the elves of the Ristalwood. They erected a massive tower keep in the forest and fought the elves for over 2,000 years before an alliance of Cormanthyr, Ristalwood, and Dark Elf followers of Illistrai managed to then finally push those Drow back onto the underground. However, a few centuries later, the orcs would come down in large numbers from the mountains, and without the Netherese to help them this time, they were overwhelmed, and the Ristalwood Kingdom of Elves were no more. Now, over here, the Elvish Kingdom of Ireland would actually last for a considerable amount of time, all the way actually until the year 882, so basically up until the end of this age. However, with many elves being eventually forced to fight orcs that had allied with demons, and then of course a severe weakening of the kingdom by elves that sought to leave in order to go back to Evermeet, the kingdom eventually fell to demonic hordes of orcs. The only true Elvish kingdom that would last past the age of humanity would be Cormanthyr, also known as the Elvish Court. If you remember, this was the place where the Seldarine gathered during the Crown Wars in order to figure out who had been responsible for those wars. Since then, the place had become something of a religious and cultural center of Elvish society, and many of the elves who had lost their homes for one reason or another, if they decided against moving to Everesca or Evermeet, they would eventually end up here in Cormanthyr. Now, Cormanthyr was actually in a better geological position than many of its other Elvish kingdoms, as they did not have to contend with orcs in the same capacity as others, which allowed them to flourish peacefully for millennia. They fought the Drow with help of Ristalwood, but it was otherwise uncontested really mostly in its territory. Interestingly enough though, it also took a different approach towards humans than many of its cousins did. Whereas the Star Elves of the Urewood and the entire kingdom of Illifarm had decided to simply abandon its lands rather than deal with the humans, Cormanthyr instead decided to ingratiate itself with the humans, to work together with them as equals. Kinda like what Ireland had tried to do at the beginning with the Netherese wizards. As humans were spreading through the south, coming from civilized Calimshan, from the west, coming from the many barbarian tribes that arrived by boat from the sea, or from the north in the form of Netherese citizens seeking to escape the devastation of their kingdom, or from the east in the form of Yandath and the Untheric immigrants, or even citizens of Narfell seeking to run away from the demonic torn land, the elves made a deal with all of these humans because they were being surrounded by humans from every side imaginable, and they made a contract with them that would be called the Dale's Compact. This agreement stipulated that humans could settle in lands around Cormanthyr so long as they settled in non-forested areas and areas not claimed by elves. And of course, so long as they did not cut down any forest governed by elves. Upon reaching this agreement with the human immigrants, a celebration was made and a massive standing stone was erected in its honor. Both the elves of Cormanthyr and the humans, which would start founding the mini-kingdoms that nowadays we call the Dale lands, decided then to commemorate this alliance further by starting a new calendar called the Dale Reckoning, which of course is the calendar that we have been using throughout this entire series of videos. So as you can already guess, this happened on the year 1 DR. The age of humanity, of course, would then stretch for another 1,000 years after this. In any case, this was definitely a tremendously momentous occasion in the history of the Forgotten Realms, as it signified for the first time as something of a real union between two different species. Because so far, we've had small alliances, right, between the dwarves and the humans, such as the dwarves of Shanatar and the humans from Calimshan, or the dwarves of Delzone and the humans of Netheril, but such alliances were there either for profit or were alliances of convenience that never truly lasted. These were not alliances of friendship and trust. And so in this case, we actually did have the very first union of friendship, and Cormanthyr would become something of a cultural heaven for not just elves, but also humans. and halflings and gnomes and dwarves and even some drow, as many races would intermingle within its great bowels for the next many centuries. Much culture would be exchanged between all of these different species and would be learned from one another, and thanks to the Dale's Compact and much of what would transpire in these forests, the beginning of what we now know as the present day would start flourishing, where different species could work together and well, just not kill each other. When you explore the present day of the Forgotten Realms and you travel through cities such as Mirabar or Waterdeep and encounter dwarves and gnomes and halflings, and you see them drinking together and working together, adventuring together, of course, all of that came down to this very moment of union and friendship. And of course, suffice it to say, this was also the birth of one of the most beloved and also populous species within the Forgotten Realms, the half-elf. So it makes sense why in the Forgotten Realms the Dale Reckoning calendar would be used as a time-keeping mechanism between the different races and kingdoms, as it was, in a lot of ways, the real birth of interspecies relations in the world. But nothing good lasts in this world, however, as the Colonel, the leader of Cormanthyr and the visionary that saw how important this union could be, died. No one was able to take its place, and the heir that was meant to replace him was assassinated by those who did not agree with letting other species within Elvish lands walk in them. Through a few centuries of political disagreements, demonic attacks, drow subterfuge, and humans overwhelmingly overpopulating the elves, the Elvish leadership finally decided that it was time for a great retreat towards Evermeet. But this would happen around 300 years after the era of humanity is over, though it was worth at least mentioning, I think. So that would happen basically around 1300 years after the Dale's Compact. I will also mention that one of the most powerful modern human kingdoms would form a few decades after the Dale's Compact, right under Cormanthyr in the form of Cormyr, though there is really not much to really tell about it. But in any case, that's it. I am 13 pages onto this script, and we also had to do a whole video just dedicated for Netheril to be a companion video to this one. I did have to fast forward through some details, but I think that we basically got all of the major bits in here. But just another set of quick notes. In here, by Eastern Shar, it is believed that there existed what would have probably been the original kingdom of the gnomes. Perhaps, maybe where they originally appeared, evolved, or were created. The kingdom was called Ollerhode, but it was said to have been absolutely annihilated by orcs. Apparently, the war between those gnomes and the orcs only lasted 10 days. They were just massacred. Then we have a kingdom of orcs that actually sprouted here called Vastar. It was awesome. These guys came from the north and destroyed the elves in here, and then settled as more and more orcs basically moved here as well. These guys lasted for about almost 1,000 years as like a true orc kingdom that would invade the lands of Cormanthyr and even held a sizable chunk of their lands for many centuries. They would obliterate sections of Narfell, they would build ships and raid the Sea of Fallen Stars, they would fight alliances of humans and elves, and many times even win those battles. Maybe one day I will do a full video about this, guys. Many of the mountain orcs that became such a problem for so many civilizations here in the East actually came from these guys who reproduced aggressively from this kingdom and then spread out all across the southern portions of the world. They were eventually defeated though, thanks to the combined effort of humans, elves, and dwarves actually. Dwarves in particular did spend hundreds of years crafting orc-slaying magical weapons and then took the brunt of that war effort. The dwarves would actually take over this region for a while, but eventually would be destroyed again by other sets of orcs, only for then humans later on to simply reproduce their way into dominating the area as humans typically do. But yeah, that's it. That's the video. This video lives us in the year 1000 DR as we end the age of humanity and then would begin what is called the present era. We don't really have a name for this new era yet since, well, we're still on it. Though so far, this present era will be known as an era of magical cataclysms and grand shiftings of the world. The Dragonborn will start appearing in this new era, gods will start walking the planet again, and a new divine order will take place as an overlord of gods would finally make itself known. Now, I don't actually think that I will be making a video for this era, actually, the present era. Maybe in the future, but I'm a bit burnt out, frankly, with the series. I just want to go back to talking about cool dragons for a while, and then after that, possibly return to the Outer Plains and cover the Nine Hells and a few other places that I've been meaning to return to, because that was a big series that we don't have completed either. But I hope you guys enjoyed the series. It was way too much research to do. The editing was particularly harder than my usual stuff, but I'm honestly glad I did it. It was a lot of fun. But what is left now in the timeline is only about 500 or so years worth of history, but that history is really mostly all the adventures that have been released. Of course, all the novels, there's a lot of kingdom building that happens, and of course, all of the deity shenanigans that transpired in between the editions to mark the differences in editions. But there it is. That's the end of the video, and I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you all so much for watching. As you all know, I make companion PDFs for every single video that I make, and for this one, I made the Quick History of the Realms, a summary of the major eras for the Forgotten Realms history, with a focus on the emergence of each major race, as well as their accomplishments and the eventual downfall for their civilizations. Now, usually I make PDFs that have a lot more mechanics in them, you know, stuff that you can actively use in your games, but it was hard to do that for a video covering history, so this PDF is largely meant to be just like an easy reference that you can always have a good idea for what happened when, or for you to get a good read on and just put everything that I talked about on this video into context. But now, if you're still watching this video, then you are one of the real ones, and because you are one of the real ones, I will give you this video's PDF for free. All you have to do is simply click on the secret link in the video description and it'll take you to the download. Okay, fine, the real reason that I'm giving you all of this for free is because this is all Forgotten Realms specific content and I do not want to get sued, so I have to give it for free. You got me. But if you do like it, there is a lot more stuff like this on my Patreon, so please consider supporting me there. Teehee. Also, do please consider checking out my store at mrrex.store to get yourself the hardcover version for Sands of Doom, or my new supplement, The Faces of Evil, if you love evil subclasses like I do. There is an evil subclass for each of the classes in 5th edition. That's a lot of content. Oh, and as a reminder, I also have Sands of Doom fully converted onto Roll20, so check that out as well. Alright, again, I will stop yapping. Thank you all so much for watching. You are the best, and I will see you all next time.